So these are all
three, right? But wait, that's the spelling. Let's start with that.
Okay, but if you want to get them.
Yeah, of course.
You have to make sure you go there. You're welcome.
I did a great job at everything, but we never connected. Colleague was in the middle as well.
Sorry, I'll see you there if I let you judge this
Don't worry, I can just speak for a few minutes.
Okay, because we can get an idea. Sure. Okay.
What's that?
You can decide. I'm going to see how many are reserved.
Yeah, if you don't mind sitting in this middle section, so if you get one, that would be great.
We need you. So, Green African,
It'll be second.
Oh, okay.
Sure, everything is disconnected, so
We'll see. You might be performing over in that area. What do you think? Well, yeah, this is good. Conceivably.
Hey, good. How are you? All right. So you guys are. I mean, we're the boat. Yeah.
We're just a little old.
For the New York stuff. Yeah. Yeah, folks there, but I don't know. So when are you doing New York? Okay. Yeah.
So Phil, I think this is not good anymore.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay.
Over here,
Yeah.
You want to show where?
yeah, I mean, see, there's cameras right
What
there.
about here?
Still. Here, inside.
Just can't have it left.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as long as I don't have to shoot through somebody's head.
No. I don't know whose stuff this is, but there.
Okay.
All he's going to do is make one announcement. So it's okay if she does it there. Just let her make one
I want to
announcement.
make sure that the music is on.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this spring's America's Forum. For those who are still outside, please make your way inside. We're about to start. And I would just like to introduce, we're going to hear from the Black Workers Chorus first, who will be opening our amazing singing.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Good morning, everybody. Bon dia.
with Monroe Doctrine. Down with Monroe Doctrine, we shall not be moved. Down with Monroe Doctrine, we shall not be moved. Just like a tree that's planted by the water, we shall not be moved.
Abajo la doctrina.
Abajo la doctrina, no nos moverán. Abajo la doctrina, no nos moverán como un árbol
Firme.
firme junto al río. No nos moverán.
La lucha.
Unidos en la lucha, no nos moverán. Unidos en la lucha, no nos moverán como un árbol firme junto al río. No nos moverán.
Shall not be moved.
We shall not be moved. We shall not be moved, just like a tree that's planted by the waters. We shall not be moved.
Paz. Paz. Queremos paz. Should I be helping them? You have
Okay.
to,
Okay.
They seem like they do need a little help.
Okay.
We understand it is early in the morning. Entendemos que ya estamos muy temprano en la mañana, pero paz.
Paz.
Queremos paz.
Paz.
Y libertad en este mundo. Spanish 101. Paz,
Queremos paz y libertad en este mundo.
Pararararam.
Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo.
Para las niñas en la frontera queremos paz y libertad.
Para las niñas en la frontera queremos paz y libertad.
Paz queremos.
Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo. Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo. Para los niños en la frontera queremos paz y libertad. Para los niños en la frontera queremos paz y libertad. Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo. Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo. Ya no más hambre, ya no más guerra, queremos paz en esta tierra. Ya no más hambre, ya no más guerra, queremos paz en esta tierra. Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo. Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo.
Ya no más bombas de radiación, no más ideas de exterminación. Ya no más bombas de radiación, no más ideas de exterminación. Paz queremos.
Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo.
Paz queremos.
Paz, queremos paz y libertad en este mundo.
Sydney Alexander, Eric Sheptock,
Hola.
Lucy Murphy. Muchísimas gracias.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming out on such a cloudy, dismal Saturday morning. I want to first, my name is Kuznik. I'm professor of history and director of the Nuclear Studies Institute here at American University. Is that better? It will be. Can you hear me okay now? Thanks. How's this? Can people hear? Great, thank you. First, I want to thank my friends from Code Pink, especially Medea, Samantha, and Michelle, for doing the heavy lifting on today's program. I've been a little hobbled myself, having had a knee replacement surgery a couple weeks ago. So I've been depending on them to do all of the serious work on this. And judging from the turnout, looks like they really succeeded. But since our focus today is on Latin America and the Caribbean, I'm going to talk about everything else for a couple minutes to introduce our day and put it in context. I want to start with a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche said, "In individuals, insanity is rare, but in groups, parties, nations, and epics, it is the rule." I think Nietzsche's words really apply to what's going on in the world today. And I look back to what Freud said in 1929 in Civilization and Its Discontents, when he posed a new duality. A duality between eros, the life instinct, and the death instinct. And it seems that collectively, as a species, we're exercising the death instinct. We're facing two major existential crises. One is the intensifying nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear annihilation. The other is planetary suicide with global warming. It was back in 2018 that the experts from the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 2 minutes before midnight. The clock began in 1947. Back in the early 50s and 53, after the US and Soviets tested their hydrogen bombs, it was moved to 2 minutes before midnight. That didn't happen again until 2018, after the US and North Korea almost went to war. In 2020, they moved the hands of the doomsday clock to 100 seconds before midnight. And then in 2021, they moved it to, or 2022, they moved it to 90 seconds before midnight. That's the reality that we're confronting now, closer to annihilation than ever. Now, given how dangerous the world has become since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I would move it even closer than 90 seconds to midnight. It was almost a decade ago when Oliver Stone and I produced our documentary film series and books titled The Untold History of the United States. I like the Spanish title even better, which was La Historia Silenciada de los Estados Unidos. And this was tracing the history of the American empire back to the 1890s, this latest phase. This was post-slavery, post-genocide against Native Americans, and beginning in the 1890s with the Spanish-American War, the United States embarked on a path to become the leading counter-revolutionary force in the world. And it begins in Cuba, but it also begins at the same time in the Philippines. And the United States begins on this dark path. And the United States, over the next century plus, has been intervening time and again to overthrow progressive governments, to occupy countries in this policy of U.S. domination of Latin America and the Caribbean. It was Samuel Huntington who said that the West, meaning the United States, won the world not by the superiority of its ideas or values or religion, but by the superior application of organized violence. Westerners often forget that fact. Non-Westerners never do. And that's what we're here to talk about in large part today. When Biden took office, some of us had a little bit of hope that he would break with the reactionary and dangerous foreign policies of the Trump administration. But we were quickly disabused of that notion. But what we see among those Westerners who reject that idea are the members of the Global South. And we're seeing them react today. The fact that countries representing more than 75% of the world's population refuse to go along with U.S. sanctions against Russia is not a sign that they embrace Russia's invasion, which they don't. It's a sign that the world sees it, much like the London Economist phrased it, says Biden wants to make this a struggle between autocracy and democracy. But the world sees it as a struggle between autocracy and hypocrisy. And that's the way we've got to see it. I got a phone call yesterday from my friend Dan Ellsberg. Now, most of you know Dan Ellsberg is the world's leading whistleblower. He's also the leading voice warning against the threat of nuclear annihilation. And Dan has been in the news a lot lately. He's 92 years old and was recently diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, inoperable pancreatic cancer. And everybody has been wanting to interview him. The New York Times, the Washington Post, everybody else wants a final interview with Dan. And Dan called and said, Peter, is my current hopelessness the fact that I have pancreatic cancer and I'm on my deathbed, or is it because the world is really in such a horrible situation? And Dan understood this because the reality is that we are really closer to doomsday in many ways than we've been. But there is some hope, and this is what there is some hope, and this is what we laid out to Dan and I discussed. Now we see the initiatives taken by Xi Jinping with his 12-point peace plan. We see the initiatives taken by Lula with his outreach. My friend Oliver Stone is now producing a documentary about Lula, which is going to be a major intervention. But Lula's peace initiative, trying to get the world behind a diplomatic solution now to the Ukrainian crisis, is a major step in the right direction. I'm about out of time, but we have a day today we're going to talk about Latin America and the Caribbean and the forces of the third world, the forces of the global south that are resisting this push for war and U.S. hegemony as we bury the Monroe Doctrine finally after 200 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter, for those words. Hello, and a warm welcome to everyone joining us here in person, and to many of you who are joining us virtually. A special thank you to all who have helped make this forum a reality, and to those making the forum engaging and accessible, including Lulo, who is a talented social muralist who will be bringing this forum to life through a painting. Patrick, who's doing the live stream. Beth and Sandra, who are doing the interpretation. So for those who need interpretation, please go in the back and see Beth and Sandra. Para los que necesitan interpretación, por favor, vayan a donde Sandra para sus equipos. I also want to give a special thank you to Angela, who's coordinating a collective board of ideas over to the left. I encourage everyone to contribute your ideas during breaks. We're here today because the U.S. unilaterally declared itself the protector of the Western Hemisphere, leading to violence and pillaging. However, where there is repression, there's always resistance. Today, we see a new world order emerging, where traditional power structures are being challenged by new movements and ideologies. This is a time of change and turmoil, but it's also an opportunity for us to build a more just and equitable world. We must continue to stand up against oppression and fight for the rights of all people. I feel humbled and honored to be in the presence of so many luchadores, so many fighters in this room who have been in this struggle longer than I have been alive. One of those people is our keynote speaker, Juan Gonzalez. Whose sheer determination and unyielding resilience is an inspiration. Juan Gonzalez has been fighting for what is right from a young age while staying true to his identity and his roots. In fact, when in kindergarten, teachers suggested that he go by John instead of Juan. Juan knew he had to speak up, and so he did, boldly proclaiming that his name was Juan and always would be. From then on, he was unapologetic about who he was and unrelenting in his pursuit of justice. Through his involvement with Young Lords Party during the late 1960s and the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights in the early 1980s, Juan discovered that he had the power not only to assert himself, but also to work with others to effect real change. Today, Juan continues to carry the lesson with him. He's an award-winning journalist and investigative reporter and author of many books, including the classic Harvest of Empire, A History of Latinos in America. He has also been the co-host of Democracy Now! Since it started in 1996. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker, Juan Gonzalez.
Thank you and good morning to all of you. It is an honor to be with you all today, to be part of this grand and growing, hopefully, alliance of people's organizations, calling for an end to the Monroe Doctrine and for a new U.S. policy toward Latin America. For more than 50 years, I have been an activist, a journalist, and a chronicler of the evolution of both the Latinx communities in the United States and of Latin America's deeply troubled relationship with U.S. leaders. As someone who was born in Puerto Rico, the last major U.S. colony, but who has lived my entire life in the barrios of the East Coast, I've been acutely aware of the direct connection between Latinos in this country and the peoples of Latin America. There are today 62 million people of Latin American descent in the United States. That says the Census Bureau as of 2020. 18.7% of the population. It's actually 65.2 million if you include the people of Puerto Rico, U.S. citizens since 1917, which the Census Bureau never does, when counting US Hispanics. That is an astounding number when you consider that a little more than 50 years ago, when I was a young radical member of the Young Lords Party, the Latinx population was just 9.1 million and represented a mere 4.5% of the population. So the first thing that we must grasp is that we are living through and witnessing an historic transformation of the very composition of the US population. The main theme of my book, Harvest of Empire, when I wrote it nearly a quarter century ago, is that the mushrooming migration from Latin America, Asia, and Africa to the rich nations of the world can only be understood and ultimately will only be resolved by a reckoning with the legacy of the colonial empires of the US and other Western nations that they created in those regions during the previous 2 centuries. Quite simply, the modern immigration crisis of the industrial direct result, an unintended result, but one nonetheless, of the political upheavals and wealth inequalities those empires produced and sustain to this day. And what, in short, were those US policies toward Latin America specifically? Repeated military, as some people have mentioned already, that led to the economic dislocation and famine in key countries, siphoning of an enormous share of the region's national wealth to el norte, especially through Wall Street debt financing, political repression by Washington-sponsored and trained leaders and civil wars fueled by US arms shipments, and aggressive labor recruitment by US industries of Latin American workers to meet the needs of those industries. When President Monroe issued his doctrine in 1823, it was hailed by Latin American leaders. At last, they thought, US neutrality toward their fight for independence from Spain would end. Gran Colombia's revolutionary president at the time, Francisco de Paula Santander, praised it as, quote, an act worthy of the classic land of liberty. With the English Navy and the United States as nominal protectors of Latin Americans' independence, the new countries of the region at least managed to avert the catastrophes that befell much of Africa and Asia when the European powers divided those regions between them during the great colonial partitions of the late 19th century. But subsequent US presidents turned the doctrine into a weapon of systematic oppression. Latin America, especially the Caribbean basin, became a US dominion with North American adventurers repeatedly seeking to grab more territory. South America's great liberator, Simón Bolívar, grew so weary of the constant arrogance from our leaders in Washington that he declared before his death the United States seemed, quote, destined by Providence to plague America with torments in the name of freedom. As thousands of US businessmen and adventurers headed south of the border, Latin America became the birthplace of the first great multinational US corporations, enriching some of the country's most celebrated families. The factual record of how the entire region was pillaged is so ample, so sordid, that it almost defies comprehension. And I don't mean the simple outright seizure and annexation of Texas and half of Mexico's territory during the Mexican-American War, territory that would later become California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and portions of Colorado and Utah. It was also the exploitation of Central and South America and the Caribbean islands. William Aspinwall, who made millions with his Panama Railroad in 1855, transporting North Americans across the isthmus from the East Coast to the California gold fields. Or Cornelius Vanderbilt's Nicaragua Transit Company, or the psychotic episode of soldier of fortune William Walker, who during his 2-year rule as a dictator of Nicaragua in the 1850s reinstituted slavery, declared English an official language of Nicaragua, and was welcomed at the White House. More than 11,000 North Americans moved to Nicaragua during Walker's reign, with 3,000 to 5,000 joining his occupation army. There was the infamous United Fruit Company, the first great US multinational corporation, with plantations in Cuba, Honduras, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and Colombia, its own railroads and shipping companies, the most powerful force in the region. There was the Havemeyer family, sugar trust that monopolized all sugar supplies to the United States, with plantations in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic, shipping all their produce to refineries in Brooklyn, Boston, and Baltimore under the name of Domino Sugar. There was the Guggenheim family, with its massive investments in Mexican railways, and the Hearst family, with cattle ranches of more than 1 million acres in northern Mexico. During the late 19th century reign of dictator Porfirio Diaz, Mexico was basically sold off to foreign investors. By 1910, more than 40,000 North Americans had settled in Mexico. 15,000 of them had gobbled up land, and they controlled 130 million acres. 27% of the entire surface area of Mexico was owned by US citizens. Americans own 78% of Mexico's mines, 73% of its smelters, 58% of its oil, 68% of its rubber business. 1898, of course, was the climactic year for the creation of the US colonial empire, as has been stated, with the seizure of Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam during the Spanish-American War. But the list of direct military interventions that ensued during the 20th century is mind-boggling. The sponsoring by Teddy Roosevelt and the US Navy of a whole country, Panama, just so Americans could secure land to build the Panama Canal. Interventions in Nicaragua 5 different times, including the war against Sandino liberation fighters from 1926 to 1933, and the CIA funding of the Contras in the 1980s. Mexico invaded 3 times, Honduras twice, Cuba 3 times after 1898. Not counting the CIA-sponsored Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961. Guatemala and the Arbenz coup in '54. Chile and Allende coup in 1973. The Dominican Republic invaded 3 times, including President Johnson's sending of thousands of US troops in 1965 to squash a people's revolt for democracy. Haiti in 1915 and again in 1994. Panama again in 1918, 1925, 1989. If Latin America had not been pillaged by US capital since its independence, millions of desperate workers would not now be coming here in such numbers to reclaim a share of that wealth. And if the United States is today the world's richest nation, it is in part because of the sweat and blood of copper workers of Chile, the tin miners of Bolivia, the fruit pickers of Guatemala and Honduras, the cane cutters of Cuba, the oil workers of Venezuela and Mexico, the pharmaceutical workers of Puerto Rico, the ranch hands of Costa Rica and Argentina, the West Indians who died building the Panama Canal, and the Panamanians who maintained it. But all that exploitation sparked a result the empire never expected. By World War II, with migration from Europe closed off, the US initiated the Bracero program, recruiting and contracting as many as 350,000 Mexican workers a year and tens of thousands of Puerto Ricans to work in US factories and fields. The result of all that labor contracting and all the instability our foreign policy created has resulted in multiple Latino migration waves to the US, differing not only in their ethnic and racial characteristics, but in their classic origins. Throughout all of this, the Monroe Doctrine has been the excuse for US meddling. It has never been renounced by the US. Even the Pope and the Vatican finally rejected this year the doctrine of discovery, the white supremacist theory that justified European domination of the native peoples of America. But our government still clings to Monroe's words, America under Washington control. Thankfully, most Latin American nations no longer follow dictates from the US. Recent elections in Mexico, Honduras, Colombia, Brazil, and Chile have brought progressive governments to virtually the entire region, and China's rise in the world economy has meant new loans and financing for the region's needs without the same strings that always came with loans from the Western banks. There are no wars, no major wars in Latin America today, no nuclear weapons, a growing commitment to tackle wealth inequality. The region has gone from a place of despair to one of hope. You don't hear any mention of this in the US commercial media's reporting on Latin American migrants, coverage that always seems to focus on the images of chaos and a border overrun. So much of the immigration debate focuses more on heat than light, more on one-sided sloganeering than dispassionate discourse, more on stoking the worst emotions among the American people rather than an honest attempt to understand the roots of the problem, then devise the most humane and sensible solutions. Throughout the administration of 4 presidents, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden, congressional leaders have failed to agree on how to overhaul the US immigration system. They failed to resolve not just the fate of unauthorized migrants within the country, but also to modernize outdated guest worker programs or to refashion processes for granting permanent visas and handling asylum seekers and refugees. They have repeatedly deadlocked on such an overhaul precisely because the stakes are so high in an increasingly multiracial nation. Any comprehensive immigration reform, after all, will determine who can legitimately become a US citizen in the 21st century. It will reshape the nation's voting population for decades to come and will alter the distribution of political and economic power at both the national and local levels, and they know it. That's why they resist immigration reform. Our immigration crisis, however, is not unique. Ever since the end of World War II, the peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, of the third world of the global south, have been coming to the West. England doesn't know what to do about all the Pakistanis, Indians, and Jamaicans. France doesn't know what to do about all the Algerians, Tunisians, and Moroccans. Germany doesn't know what to do about all the Turks and Syrians. The Netherlands about all the Indonesians. And in the United States, our leaders have grappled for decades with what to do about all the Latin American and Caribbean peoples and increasingly Africans and Asians that have migrated here. The key thing to understand is that the migrations have come from the very countries those metropolitan powers once colonized or dominated. And in recent years, we've seen the heartbreaking images of boat people crossing the Mediterranean to get to Italy, Greece, and the Balkan states, with thousands perishing at sea in their attempts, but tens of thousands reaching Europe, many corralled into camps and detention centers. Where do these refugees come from? From Syria, from Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Yemen, countries where during the past 2 decades our own government's military interventions, occupations, and targeted bombings and assassinations have tragically led to greater violence and instability than previously existed. The sudden surge of people fleeing one country for another did not arise from thin air or from individual decisions made to simply seek a better life in another country. Rather, they are manifestations of profound flaws in the economic and political systems of our modern world. Much of it, I would submit to you, is the unintended harvest of past colonial empires and of a new stage of economic and political domination where the US, an empire in decline, is determined to use its military might to master the world, a rules-based order where Washington makes all the rules. But these migrations have been going on for so long now that they have reached critical mass, where they have begun to transform the actual composition of the receiving nations. Latinos in the US are in a unique position among all the modern migrant groups. We come from a region of the world that has not only provided the bulk of this country's new migrants for the past 50 years, some of us trace our heritage to families that were living on what is now the US before it was the US. And a growing number of Latino migrants trace their origins to the indigenous the indigenous peoples of America, or descendants from the enslaved Africans of the region. The enormous contributions of the Latin American diaspora to U.S. prosperity rarely gets acknowledged. It is critically important to extol those contributions when others try to disseminate stereotypes of Mexico and other Latin American nations sending only criminals and paupers. Even today, the hardest, most menial, and least appreciated work in the U.S. is performed by Latino migrants. Those who pick the fruits and vegetables that nourish us, who butcher the meat and poultry we consume, who tend our lawns and repair our roofs, who build our houses and haul our waste, who clean the hotels we use and the office buildings where we work, who wash the dishes and clear the tables in restaurants where we eat, who keep our universities clean and sparkling, are invariably Latino. After 60 years of steady migration, the children of those Latin American migrants, most of them born or raised in this country, are on the cusp of transforming the United States. There are 3 million Latinx youth enrolled in American colleges and universities today. And the public school population is even bigger. More than 50% of the children in Texas and California public schools are Latino. More than 25% in Illinois and New York. 15% to 17% in Georgia and North Carolina. Many of them have been involved with the Dreamers, leading the movement to legalize not just undocumented youth, but their parents and relatives as well. But Latino youth across the nation have set precedent to other issues as well. The quest for answers to the disappearances of the students of Ayotzinapa, and to all the mass violence in Juarez and all of Mexico, to stopping the detention of migrant children and families at the border, ending police abuse, racial profiling, and mass incarceration of Black and Latino youth for minor offenses, winning a big jump in the minimum wage and paid sick leave for all who are employed. But there's much more to do, especially in the area of saving our planet from the ravages of climate change and achieving full equality for lesbians, gays, and transgender individuals. And many of you are involved in those causes as well. In 1969, when I was a young Latino activist, I helped found, as mentioned, the Young Lords, a radical Puerto Rican group, and later the National Congress for Puerto Rican Rights. The Lords, along with the Brown Berets, Mecha, La Raza Unida Party, August 29th Movement, CASA, had enormous influence on my generation, despite arrests and beatings and persecution that we endured. Our activism opened these universities to Black and brown students. It achieved the creation of the first Puerto Rican, Chicano, and Latino studies programs, the hiring of the first Latino professors, our free breakfast programs, and those of our allies in the Black Panther Party, and our exposure of the epidemic of lead-based paint in urban tenements led to reforms that eliminated lead-based paint. That summer of 1969, a young Puerto Rican poet and supporter of ours named Pedro Pietri recited for the first time at one of our sit-ins a new poem he had just finished writing. He called it Puerto Rican Obituary. It is one of the great epic poems of the 20th century. And Pedro would go on to become internationally acclaimed for his work. Hearing him recite it cemented my lifelong commitment to fighting for social justice. I want to share a few lines with you because it still speaks not just to Puerto Ricans or Latinos, but to every North American and Latin American of working class origins. And this was the start of Pedro's poem. They worked. They were always on time. They were never late. They never spoke back when they were insulted. They worked. They never took days off that were not on the calendar. They never went on strike without permission. They worked 10 days a week and were only paid for 5. They worked, they worked, they worked, and they died. They died broke. They died owing. They died never knowing what the front entrance of the First National City Bank looks like. Juan, Miguel, Milagros, Olga, Manuel, all died yesterday, today, and will die again tomorrow, passing their bill collectors on to the next of kin. All died waiting for the Garden of Eden to open up again under a new management. all died dreaming about America, waking them up in the middle of the night screaming, "Mira, mira, your name is on the winning lottery ticket for $100,000. All died hating the grocery stores that sold them make-believe steak and bulletproof rice and beans. All died waiting, dreaming, and hating. Dead Puerto Ricans who never knew there were Puerto Ricans, who never took a coffee break from the 10th commandment to kill, kill, kill the landlords of their cracked skulls and communicate with their Latino souls. Not just the first few stanzas of this remarkable poem that awakened and inspired a generation of the Latin American diaspora. Pedro passed away in 2004 at the age of 59, but he lives in his timeless verse. It is up to us, but especially the young people of this country, to demand a new way, an end to the empire whose evil deeds the Monroe Doctrine first sought to cloak in elegant words. There has been progress. Latin America is no longer the backyard of the empire. It is the front yard of a world movement for social justice and peace. From Mexico to Honduras, from Cuba to Venezuela and Nicaragua, from Colombia to Brazil and Chile, from Bolivia to Argentina, the governments and peoples of Latin America are charting their own future. Take Chile, for example, with one of the world's biggest reserves of lithium, the holy grail of electric batteries. President Rafael Boric announced this week that he will seek to nationalize the lithium mining in his country and will involve Chile's indigenous groups in helping to decide a humane way to develop this vital resource. His announcement sent tremors through many capitalist circles. But Latin America no longer fears the CIA, the IMF, and their own right-wing elites, determined to live in a multipolar world, to sell their goods and build alliances with whoever treats them with respect, whether it is be a European power or Russia or China or the US. They're tired of Washington demanding obedience to its version of democracy and reacting only with sanctions, arrogance, and regime change to all who dare challenge its hegemony. We are here today to say those days are over. It's time the American people learned the truth about the US role in Latin America. Time that Congress, the White House, and all Americans of goodwill demand an end once and for all to the heinous Monroe Doctrine and the ideology behind it. We will spend the rest of the day discussing ways to spread this message throughout the land to ordinary Americans and to their elected officials. So let's get to work, and as we used to say in the Young Lords, pa'lante, siempre pa'lante, hasta la victoria. Thank you.
Big round of applause, please. Thank you. Palante. So my name is Marco Castillo. Good morning, everyone from Global Exchange. And I'm sorry, but I'm going to be the timekeeper this morning. We want to have a program where everybody gets a chance to speak. And we are going to be just like trying to make sure that we move along the program swiftly. So right now, we're going to welcome the members of our first panel. Please come up to the table, please, at the front. Thank you very much. Our moderator will be introducing them. Great speech, indeed. Please help me welcoming Frederick Mills, please. Dr. Frederick, if you're so kind, take it over. Yeah.
Greetings and thank you to Juan Gonzalez for that inspiring speech that set the tone. On behalf of the Americas Forum Planning Committee, I'd like to welcome panelists and participants, both present and online, to our first panel discussion on opposing sanctions and unilateral intervention. My name's Fred Mills. I'm professor of philosophy at Bowie State University and deputy director of the Council on Hemispheric Affairs. We stand at a crossroads, as Juan Gonzalez pointed out, a crossroads of transition in both the geopolitical and regional spheres. These are ultimately immediately related. The Monroe Doctrine today is in part an expression of the contradiction between the US-NATO drive to impose a unipolar world and the already emergent multipolar world. In the Western Hemisphere, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, has declared the region a region of peace and rejects pressure to be part of the new Cold War. There's an ongoing clash between Monroeism and the irreversible Bolivarian cause of regional integration and independence. It's time to bury the Monroe Doctrine, which is based on coercion and domination, and for the US to transition to a foreign policy based on respect for the sovereign equality of nations, a sovereign equality which has its seat in the people. Our focus in this panel is the US deployment of illegal economic sanctions aimed at undermining democratically elected progressive governments in Latin America and the Caribbean and limiting their self-determined collaboration with Russia, China, and other trading partners. Combined with hybrid war interventions, these unilateral coercive measures are responsible for mass deaths, hardship, emigration, and billions of dollars in asset theft. These measures are illegal under international and humanitarian law. They violate human rights by disrupting elected governments in their efforts to provide citizens with food, pharmaceuticals, fuel, and sanitation supplies. This panel will address the political, legal, ethical, and economic dimensions of sanctions and their devastating impact on general populations. But it will also address the strategies by which Latin American and Caribbean governments and citizens circumvent sanctions and advance their own approaches to development, foreign policy, trade, and security, despite the hardships. Our first speaker, Dr. Steve Elner, is a U.S. scholar who has taught economic history and political science at Universidad de Oriente, Venezuela, since 1977. He's the author of numerous books and journal articles on Venezuela, Venezuelan history, politics, and organized labor. He's also an associate managing editor of the journal Latin American Perspectives. Dr. Elner received his MA at Southern Connecticut State University and his PhD at the University of New Mexico. All of his degrees are in Latin American history. Welcome, Dr. Elner.
Fred? Is this mic? Okay, I'm going to turn it on.
Just move it closer. Yeah.
Round of applause, please. We feel your pain. Black people, indigenous people, build this country. We're going to take a 5-minute break, please, and then come back to continue with the panel as we help ourselves here, please.
Ma'am, everything you're saying is valid. We're not disagreeing with you at all. You have very good points. If you look at me, I'm one of these folks you're talking about. So everything you're saying is valid, you know, and we're not at all disagreeing with you. Okay.
Yes, true.
the world. It's gonna last forever and ever. We're gonna change the world. Gonna do that again. No more racism. We are gonna change the world. No more racism. We are gonna change the world. No more racism. We are gonna change the world. It's gonna last forever and ever. We're gonna change the world. No more sexism. No more sexism. We are gonna change the world. No more sexism. We are gonna change the world. No more sexism. We are gonna change the world. It's gonna last forever and ever. We're gonna change the world. No homophobia. We are gonna change the world. Well, now, no homophobia. We are gonna change the world. No homophobia. We are gonna change the world. It's gonna last forever and ever. We're gonna change the world.
Please, big round of applause. Big round of applause. Thank you for bearing with us. We'll continue with the program. This is the world that we live in. It is okay. It is fine. She had to express something, and we just wanted to make sure that she didn't feel kicked out of the room, heard, and then we all laughed with her. I think she's in good hands, and I think we're good to go with the program. I don't think we need to have any violence and to deal with this situation, because we feel her pain. We are here to reflect and think, how do we deal with that pain? Because it's a reality. She's carrying the pain of millions of people, centuries. And that's what we're here for. She's another big reason to keep fighting and keep working. So let's get going with the program. And thank you very much. All yours.
Okay, 200 years since the issuing of the Monroe Doctrine, the pundits, the politicians, the policymakers in Washington are dividing over the Monroe Doctrine. They're divided over U.S. policy in Latin America in general. Nevertheless, there's some people who say, and I'm one of them, that division between the soft left, rather the soft liners and the hard liners in Washington, the difference perhaps in many ways between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, that division is really, in essence, the division between the good cop and the bad cop. The famous, binary of the good cop and the bad cop, but really both are on the same page, both are pursuing the same objectives. But the Republicans, in general, represent the hardliners when it comes to Latin America. And yet, there are a number of very important Democrats who are also in that camp. For instance, Bob Menendez, who heads the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. And some may ask if the Democrats are really serious about representing an alternative to the Republicans when it comes to foreign policy in general, when it comes to foreign policy in Latin America. Why did they allow a hardliner, somebody who many people say is really Republican when it comes to foreign policy, why did they allow Bob Menendez to hold that position? The hardline position is best articulated by the neocons. The neocons who say that the Monroe Doctrine is alive and well. And those aren't my words. Those are John Bolton's words when he was security advisor, national security advisor, and he said, and I quote, in this administration, in other words, the Trump administration, we're not afraid to use the phrase Monroe Doctrine. The second position was expressed by John Kerry when he was Secretary of State. And in a speech, he stated that the U.S. policy is no longer about the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine no longer represents U.S. policy. And his exact words in that speech was, it's about all of our countries viewing one another as equals, sharing responsibilities, cooperating on security issues, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, the United States doesn't renounce intervention. The United States renounces unilateral intervention. And you might say that in certain ways, that idea that the United States doesn't intervene unilaterally, that very concept goes back to the Monroe Doctrine. Some people back in 1823 favored a joint statement between the United States and Great Britain directed against the European powers on the continent of Europe. But in any case, what about that statement that Kerry made? That the Monroe Doctrine is over and the United States doesn't intervene unilaterally. Well, what about the UN votes on the sanctions against Cuba during the Obama administration? They all, the vast majority of nations voted and continue to vote against the sanctions against Cuba. And also, in the case of Venezuela, it was under Obama that the sanction regime was really established against Cuba, against Venezuela. When in 2015, Obama declared Venezuela a threat to US national security, and at that moment, 7 Venezuelans were sanctioned. And that really opened the doors, that set the stage for the sanction regime of the Trump administration, and those sanctions were really designed to strangle the Venezuelan economy. But the main question now is with regard to Biden. Has Biden softened his position on the position of the US government on sanctions? And has Kerry's statement with regard to unilateral intervention, that the United States renounces unilateral intervention, is that really the policy of the Biden administration? Well, look, in the case of Nicaragua, the sanctions in 2022 and up until the present have been tightened, have been intensified, particularly in the area of mining, and with regard to investments, with regard to imports, with regard to exports. And there is no evidence at all that the Biden administration is thinking in terms of phasing out the system of sanctions. The Biden administration has really changed course in terms of the strategy of the Trump government, because under Trump, the policy was regime change. And now Biden's policy is not that. Not to say that people in Washington don't want to change regimes in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, just that it was evident, among the Democrats at least, prior to the 2020 elections, that the regime change strategy of the Trump administration had failed. Chris Murphy, the senator from Connecticut, stated that prior to the elections, that regime change was a failure and some other policy or some other strategy had to be pursued.
3 minutes.
How many?
3 more.
3 minutes. I was all set on 15 minutes, but I didn't realize that 15 minutes.
15? No, sure. You got 15 minutes.
What's that?
You're
How
good
many-
for
how many
5.
minutes do I have?
You have 15 minutes, but you already took 12.
Well,
It's fun.
I'm talking slower than I thought.
Time flies.
Okay, well, let me just sum up then. Yeah, okay, I'll just make this final point. And that is that the Biden administration is in some ways more hypocritical than Trump. Not to say that I'm pro-Trump at all, but if you consider the rhetoric coming out of Washington under Trump and today, under Trump, the idea was regime change, and the regime change to, change a dictator and bring in democracy in Venezuela and perhaps in Cuba. That, of course, was a bogus justification. We all know that. But in the case of Biden, the strategy is different. The strategy is one of horse trading. We will lift some sanctions if Maduro, for instance, makes certain concessions to us. Concessions in the area of geopolitics, concessions in the area of political change in favor of not the opposition in general, but the hardline opposition, who are the people that we're supporting in Venezuela, and also economic changes in favor of investments in Venezuela. For instance, in the case of geopolitics, it's been made quite clear to Maduro that if he were to move away from Russia with regard to the Ukraine conflict, that the United States would lift certain sanctions. With regard to economic policy, Bloomberg News, among other newspapers, have indicated in detail that the Maduro government has to move away from statist-type policies, which he has to a certain extent. He has implemented certain pro-business or business-friendly policies. And the leftist factions within the left in Venezuela have very, very harshly criticized him, beginning with the Communist Party of Venezuela. But he's made those moves, but Washington wants more. And that is evident reading Bloomberg and other newspapers in terms of the specifics, what Maduro has to do in order to get sanctions partially lifted. And with regard to the opposition, yes, the negotiations that are now taking place and the attempt to establish negotiations or resume negotiations in Mexico favors the hardline opposition. If the hardline opposition, which is Guaidó's Voluntad Popular, Acción Democrática, Primero Justicia, Un Nuevo Tiempo, their groupings, their grouping is called La Plataforma Unitaria. If they were to come out against sanctions, the United States would lift the sanctions, but they're not. The opposition is divided between those hardliners and a more moderate, pragmatic, I would say sensible opposition that is opposed to the sanctions, that recognizes the legitimacy of the Maduro government. The United States is not with them. They're with the hardliners. And so our policy with regard to sanctions is really designed to favor, to promote U.S. interests when it comes to geopolitics, when it comes to politics, and when it comes to the economy. I would call that hypocritical. Now, many of you may say, why am I calling Uncle Joe hypocritical? But the fact of the matter is that there's no veneer, as there was under Trump. The United States is out to defend its interests, promote its interests, and at the expense of the people of Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Elner. Our next panelist, Sarah Flounders, has been active in people's movements for change since the 1960s. Presently, she coordinates the International Action Center, the Sanctions Kill campaign, and works with United National Anti-War Coalition. She's a contributing editor of the Marxist newspaper Workers' World and challenges U.S. wars on alternative and corporate media outlets. She has organized past solidarity delegations to countries devastated by U.S. wars and sanctions. She recently returned from sanctioned Nicaragua. Flounders has co-authored and edited 10 books on U.S. wars, sanctions, and expanding NATO. She recently released the anthology, Sanctions, a Wrecking Ball in a Global Economy, and worked on a Chinese-U.S. documentary with Chinese, English, Spanish subtitles called Vaccines and Sanctions. Welcome, Sarah Flounders.
Good morning. Let's talk about the death of the Monroe Doctrine. It's an honor to participate in this exchange today, and as part of the Sanctions Kill campaign, I couldn't agree more with the focus on sanctions, blockades, and coercive economic measures. Our Sanctions Kill campaign is dedicated to explaining how sanctions as a crime against humanity intentionally targets the most vulnerable and deprives millions of basic essentials. Now, 40 countries, a third of the global population is impacted by sanctions. Sanctions by the US and its allies have caused millions of deaths around the world. I've seen this up close in many trips to Iraq during the 1990s. I've seen the impact of sanctions in isolated, surrounded Gaza, in Israeli-bombed Lebanon, in Sudan during famine, in former Yugoslavia. I was there during the US-NATO bombing. And you see it in resilient Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua in this hemisphere. But there are new forms of resistance arising, and I want to deal with three different kinds of resistance. First, resistance by developing economic self-sufficiency. Now, North Korea survived 70 years of the world's harshest international sanctions, and they have a term for self-reliance, juche. Now, I'm going to deal more with Nicaragua because it's so under such harsh attack and propaganda war right now, and because I was recently in Nicaragua. Nicaragua today, 90% self-sufficiency in food. That's a big accomplishment. Nicaraguans coped heroically with COVID, with door-to-door health care, while the US blocked their access to vaccines. Education is free. The Sandinista government has developed essential infrastructure, especially in roads, health clinics, and schools. Nicaragua now ranks among the top in the world in gender parity. Women fill more than half the seats in the legislatures, local to national, and in administration, medicine, in the rural economy, bottom to top. Yet, small Nicaragua is declared a US national security threat. As a matter of fact, an extraordinary threat. Precisely because they're the threat of a good example, an alternative in a neoliberal world. The US tries to justify its inhumane sanctions by funding a whole host of NGOs that interfere in the internal affairs not only of Nicaragua, but every targeted country. In the midst of sanctioning Nicaragua, a biased, sensationalized human rights report was leaked this March, 2023, with the corporate media playing their usual role. This report didn't take the well-documented material from the Nicaraguan government that was readily available. No. And I happened to be in Nicaragua when this latest smear campaign report was released. It was to justify US-instigated violent regime change operation in 2018 and its host of paid operatives. So-called human rights that the US so frequently accuses targeted countries of violating are little more than a cynical ploy, a weapon, a club. And our role as solidarity activists here in the US is to refuse to be part of the US propaganda machine that promises human rights while delivering misery. I hope everyone here will take an opportunity to sign the statement rejecting these fraudulent reports and these continuing attacks that Nicaragua is a threat out at the Nicaragua Solidarity table. Now, the second force of resistance is the growing solidarity among the sanctioned countries themselves. For example, Cuba, who provides more doctors than the World Health Organization in Africa, Cuba developed its own COVID vaccine to share with the Cubans and with the world. But they didn't have and couldn't get the syringes for their own population to give them the shot. That took an international solidarity campaign. And that's another part of resistance to sanctions. It's all of us here building solidarity and the aid campaigns with the countries under sanctions. We're a part of this, and it's by not being confused by the propaganda campaigns of the U.S. The web of thousands of U.S. restrictions that strangle economies for the benefit of corporate power is growing. In the past 20 years, U.S. sanctions grew from 912 to 9,421. That's astronomical. And I repeat, it's now 40 countries, a third of humanity, under sanctions attack.
5 minutes.
The third part of resistance to sanctions is coordination among sanctioned countries. Sanctions are part of regime change strategy to promote hyperinflation, chronic shortages, supply chain chaos. These sanctions undermine social progress such as land distribution, food subsidies, and expanded education and health care. What's new? What's new, though? Change is coming rapidly with earth-shaking implications, and these new developments are burying the Monroe Doctrine that asserted that no foreign power except the U.S. would be allowed in Latin America and the Caribbean, and any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas by foreign powers was a hostile act against U.S. interests. Well, 200 years later, the countries of Latin America are collectively acting and finding alternatives to this continuing threat of invasions and coups and sanctions. China is now South America's top trading partner. Between 2000 and 2020, China, Latin American, Caribbean trade grew 26-fold from $12 billion to $310 billion. China is now among the top sources of foreign direct investment and finance. And now, sanctioned Russia, Iran, China provide vital lifelines to sanctioned Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Isn't that a change? All of these countries are determined to survive and thrive. The impact is wider than trade just among the sanctioned countries. China's now the dominant trading partner for Chile, Peru, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Ecuador. China, Brazil, and Argentina just signed a deal to trade in their local currencies. The BRICS countries, that's Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new development bank, they offer an alternative to the U.S.-dominated International Monetary Fund. U.S. strategists, both Democrat and Republican, are worried because the sanctions are losing their threat. Secretary of the U.S. Treasury, Janet Yellen, she's a former chair of the Federal Reserve, she admitted that Washington's imposition of unilateral sanctions on countries around the world could weaken the dominance of the dollar. She conceded U.S. sanctions create a desire to find an alternative to the dollar. And likewise, Republican Senator Marco Rubio complained, we won't have to talk about sanctions in 5 years because there'll be so many countries transacting in currencies other than the dollar, and we won't have the ability to sanction them. I'm winding up. Of course, these war criminals are concerned about their almighty dollar dominance and not with the human consequences of sanctions. We got to make that distinction. It was the imposition of U.S. and EU sanctions on Russia based on the NATO war in Ukraine that undermined the U.S. use of sanctions dramatically. The sanctions didn't create an economic collapse in Russia, as Biden predicted, but cutting the trade hurt the EU economy far more than the Russian economy, and it forced the birth of de-dollarization. There'll still be ruthless decisions to enforce the Monroe Doctrine, but U.S. imperialism, the biggest impediment to development and progress in Latin America and the Caribbean, is being severely challenged. U.S. corporate domination is in a constant alliance with the most reactionary forces. Now, in closing, I want to say a word on reparations, because justice demands we support reparations for the sanctioned countries, for the damage to their economy, the shortened lives of their population. In 1986, the International Court of Justice ruled that the U.S. violated Nicaragua's sovereignty in the arming and training of the Contras, the mining of Nicaragua's harbors, and was due reparations. The U.S. didn't pay. In 2017, Nicaragua revived their claim against the United States for compensation of $17 billion, reparations. They should pay. France owes Haiti at least $28 billion in return for reparations that Haiti was forced to pay for freeing themselves from enslavement. How outrageous. Consider the wealth stolen not only from sanctioned Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but all the countries of the global former colonized South. Just as descendants of enslaved and indigenous people in the U.S. are due reparations for stolen land and stolen labor, so too are the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean due reparations for past U.S. invasions, expropriations, and sanctions. In closing, I want to say a word about the case of Alex Saab, the Venezuelan special envoy who's imprisoned by the U.S. because he helped bring desperately needed humanitarian supplies, food, fuel, medicine to Venezuela in convention of the illegal sanctions, and he was doing it by legal trade and exchange. I traveled to Cabo Verde when Alex Saab was being held captive, tortured, to bring attention to his case. Alex Saab was kidnapped again and brought to Miami, where he's now imprisoned. His cancer, which was in remission, has reasserted, and he is without adequate medical treatment. And in this emergency, I do want to urge this conference to find a way to go on record calling for Alex Saab's release. So I say to the family here, in conclusion, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua in our hemisphere are targeted for regime change by the U.S. empire, and it's not because of the things they've done wrong. It's because of the things they've done right. They give us a glimpse of a better world, an alternative vision from the imperialist-dominated unipolar world order, and that's why they're being attacked. And we got to stand in solidarity with them and their right to defend themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Flounders. As you can see, we have a great mix of presentations, and thanks to Dr. Elner for opening a window on U.S. politics and sanctions, and to Sarah Flounders for the excellent schema for understanding sanctions, and in particular, those three forms of resistance. Now I'd like to introduce our next panelist, Liz Oliva Fernandez. She's an award-winning Cuban journalist and producer with Belly of the Beast. She's won a Gracie Award and was co-winner of a One World Media Award for her work presenting the documentary series, The War on Cuba. Apart from her journalism and filmmaking, Fernandez is a dedicated anti-racist and feminist activist. Let's welcome Liz Oliva Fernandez.
Thank you. I feel honored. I know that I have just a couple of minutes, so I'm going to be quickly. Before I start my presentation, I just want to say that the episode we have here today, I have been seeing this pain during the many screamings that we have been doing in the United States. So I just want to say that I stand with this, in solidarity with the Black people in the United States. We have the same enemy, the U.S. imperialism. So if there is something that I can do, just let me know. Let's talk about Cuba. When I graduated from journalism school in 2016, I never imagined that I would spend most of my career talking about U.S. sanctions against my country. At the time, young and eager to eat up the world, I longed to tell the people of Cuba about our internal problems and hold our government accountable. I felt it was my duty to be the voice of the voiceless. At that time, of course, I knew about the U.S. sanctions against my country. I had been hearing about them all my life, so much so that it had become second nature to me. And I was tired of hearing the same speech over and over again, not understanding how it worked or why we keep repeating the same things decades later. I didn't know the story of Ernesto, a farmer who dreamed of being an athlete, but who lost both his legs in the 90s, and since then has not been able to get the prosthetics he needs. Not because Cuba doesn't want to buy them, but because it's illegal for Cuba to buy them in Europe, but because 10% of the materials used to make them come from the United States. At the time I finished university, Cuba was booming. Presidents Raul Castro and Barack Obama had announced the normalization of relations between the two countries. Sanctions had been easy, and Havana was a beautiful, thriving place where people around me talk about entrepreneurship and future projects inside Cuba. That was the year I made the most of my friends, US friends. Friends who came to Cuba through exchange programs of all kinds, from academic to cultural ones. Friends who brought their parents to visit my country because it was not legal for Americans to visit Cuba as a tourist. All this seemed very distant, very rare to me, because I didn't understand how in the land of freedom, one could not have the freedom to travel wherever they want. During that time, I didn't know that Amberly, a filmmaker and photographer from Baltimore, and Alexei, a newer Cuban hip-hop musician, had a painful long-distance relationship and were unable to see each other for several years because she, as an American, couldn't return to Havana on her own, and he, as a Cuban, couldn't obtain a tourist visa to the United States. Cuba has one of the highest rates of denial USB visas, tourist or business, in the world. According to the U.S. State Department data, 81.9% of all Cuban applications were denied in fiscal year 2016. Afghanistan was second in application denials, with its refusal rate at 73.8%, due in large part to the active war the United States was waging at that time. In November of 2016, Trump won the elections and he became president of the United States, and the hope for a better future in Cuba began to be threatened. At first, I thought it was just Trump's cheap bluster. I don't have to tell you what that looks like, but no, Donald Trump has gone down in history as one of the US presidents who has done the most damage to the Cuban people, and unfortunately, he will not be the only one. Under the Trump administration, our main sources of income began to be attacked one by one: tourism, medical missions, the biotech industry. It was as if he wanted us to succumb. And if that were enough, before he left, Trump put Cuba on the list of countries that sponsored terrorism, which was a death sentence to my country. During that time, my friend Alina, an academic and feminist respect not only in Cuba but throughout Latin America for her anti-racist work, had to start in Colombia for more than 24 hours before she continued her trip to Europe. And although she had a visa to enter Colombia, she wasn't allowed to leave the airport because she was considered suspicious for coming from Cuba, a country that the United States says sponsored terrorism. Trump is no longer in the White House. Now it's Biden, but the sanctions remain in the same place. It is funny for me to be here to hear about the difference between Republicans and Democrats, because in my experience as a Cuban journalist living in Cuba, the policy towards Cuba is the same no matter which party president belongs to. It's frustrating and sad to talk about Cuba nowadays. I used to love to talk about the wonderful country I was born in, the people, the home I live in, but that started to change when most of my friends began to emigrate to all parts of the world. And I fully understand why they left. It's very hard to live in a country with one crisis after another, where you don't see that you have a future there, where you spend your time trying to survive as best you can. But know that this is not life, that calling ourselves resilience is something that we say to be optimists, but it involves a lot of physical and emotional wear and tear, because no one should have to survive in these conditions, because we all deserve to live in a prosperous countries with opportunities for everyone. But how can this be achieved in a country that has been in economic war with the most powerful country in the world for more than 60 years? Let us not be confused by the mainstream media discourse. The vast majority of Cubans who arrive at the United States border seeking asylum are not political refugees, they are economic refugees. Sometimes I feel very lonely in my struggle to stay in Cuba and build a better country. And I wonder if I'm doing the right thing. Fortunately, journalism have given the opportunity to meet women like Greta, a Black entrepreneur who has cosmetic business with natural hair and body oils, and who, despite all of the obstacles that exist to make her business grow, and who knows that it's almost impossible to expand her business outside of Cuba because the sanctions, doesn't imagine developing her brand Tilan in another country that is not Cuba. I
5
think
minutes.
it is because we know that immigration is not easy, as they want to make it seem. That the American dream is a lie that has been sold us since we were very young. That leaving your family and trying to adapt to a new society, sometimes very different from yours, can be traumatic. That the dream can turn into a nightmare. The only problem is that it seems we have no choice because we have no voice or vote in this country, because it doesn't depend on us if the United States government lifts the sanctions against my country. People ask me what a Cuba without sanctions will be like. The truth is I don't know, but I would like to find out. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that wonderful expression of what we all coincide with is a Cuba without sanctions. Our next panelist, Dr. Francisco Rodriguez, is a Venezuelan economist with decades of experience in public service, academia, and the private sector. Currently, he is the Rice Family Professor of the Practice of International and Public Affairs at the University of Denver's Corbell School of International Studies, and director and founder of Oil for Venezuela, a nonprofit organization focused on finding solutions to Venezuela's humanitarian crisis. Rodriguez has held prominent positions in the public and private sectors, including head of economic and financial advisory of the Venezuelan National Assembly, and head of the research team of the United Nations Human Development Report Office. He received an MA and PhD in economics from Harvard University. Let's welcome Francisco Rodriguez.
Thank you. Good morning, almost good afternoon. I'd like to thank the organizers, the Americas Policy Forum, for this invitation to talk about the effect of economic sanctions, particularly in Latin America. US President Woodrow Wilson described sanctions as something more tremendous than war. And the reason that he used this phrase is because sanctions, as we know them, really came into being during World War I. Although there's a long history of sanctions used previous to that, sanctions in an interconnected economy really only had the bite that they have nowadays after the world economy had become globalized in the late 19th century. And in effect, if you consider and think a bit about the way in which economic sanctions and economic blockade were first used in the context of World War I, most of the evidence actually points to the fact that sanctions and the blockade imposed by world powers on Germany during World War I were really what led to the outcome of the war. So the way that Woodrow Wilson thought about this is something that can really destroy an economy and should only be used or should only be threatened to be used in order to avoid having another world war. So in other words, Woodrow Wilson was thinking that sanctions were so damaging that they would never be used. That's the way in which they were set up during the League of Nations. And I think that he would have been quite dismayed if he had come to this world that we have nowadays and had found the way in which sanctions are recurrently used by world powers, to the extent that over the course of the past few decades, we've reached a level at which economic sanctions affect more than 1/4 of countries in the world and nearly 1/3 of the world's economy. So in a paper that I am just publishing with the Center for Economic Policy and Research, which you'll find a copy of the executive summary outside, and I think that you'll be able to download it from Tuesday. I look at the evidence on the effect of economic sanctions on the standards of living in target populations, in the populations of targeted countries. I do a comprehensive survey and assessment of all existing studies that use quantitative methods, both econometric methods, calibration methods, in order to quantify the effect of sanctions on living standards. And the results are actually quite striking. There's a near consensus in studies. 30 out of 32 studies actually find consistently negative significant effects of sanctions on living standards on variables ranging from GDP to health to human rights, life expectancy, nutrition. Every single dimension of living standards is negatively affected. The effects quantitatively are very large. Sanctions can cause a recession or a contraction in the GDP of targeted countries of up to 26% of GDP. That's the equivalent of a Great Depression. Sanctions on average lead to a decline of life expectancy of between 1.2 and 1.4 years. That's the equivalent of the effect on life expectancy of the COVID pandemic. Sanctions lead to increases in HIV rates, for example, among both adults and children. There's a host of quantitative evidence that finds that sanctions have effects which are similar, if not in some cases actually larger than the effects of armed conflict. There is a sense in which sanctions at this moment are the most powerful, the deadliest weapon that is used by world powers, including by the United States. Nevertheless, whenever we see statements coming out of authorities in the US or in the European Union or even in the United Nations, they tend to disregard the effect of sanctions. They tend to use specious arguments, essentially to claim that these effects are not due to sanctions, that they're due to other causes, that if the sanctions were lifted, the targeted governments would not use those resources for the benefit of their population. And these arguments are really wrong at a very basic level. They reflect a very basic misunderstanding of the way in which governments work. And even the most authoritarian governments in the world use the resources of their state to provide basic public goods and services, such as health and education. I mean, there's no government that does not do that, and therefore severely curtailing the access that an economy has to foreign exchange and severely curtailing the access of governments to resources is bound to have an impact on living standards through the declines that it causes in public health, public education provision, and also through the effects that it generates on the economy's capacity to access imports and to access capital flows. In my work in particular, I've looked, and this study looks at the cases of Venezuela, Iran, and Afghanistan and documents the negative effects on living standards in those countries. In a lot of my published research, I've looked at the case of Venezuela. In the case of Venezuela, it's quite striking. Venezuela has suffered a contraction of 72% in its GDP. That's the equivalent of 3 Great Depressions. It is the largest economic contraction ever documented in world history in a country outside of wartime. Now, what is it that caused that economic contraction? It's actually not that difficult to understand what drove it. It's a complete collapse of its oil industry. Venezuelan oil exports contributed 95% of exports, of the country's total exports, and more than 50% of fiscal revenue. And oil exports fell by 91% between 2012 and 2020. Now, part of that decline was driven by a decline in oil prices, and particularly a decline in oil prices that occurred between 2014 and 2016, which was when global oil prices fell from around $100 to less than $30 a barrel. But after 2016, oil prices began to recover. So what does history, what does econometrics, what do all of the studies and all of the literature on the workings of the Venezuelan economy tell us we should have expected to happen when oil prices rose from less than $30 a barrel in 2016 to more than $70 a barrel? We should have expected Venezuela's economy to recover. It didn't. Why didn't it recover? Because oil production started falling precipitously. So in my work, as well as other Venezuelan economists, have been looking at the effect of sanctions on oil production. And what do we find? We find that every single application of sanctions in Venezuela is associated with a decline in the country's oil production. Venezuela's oil production, that doesn't mean that all of the decline in oil production is due to sanctions, but it could well mean that most of it is due to sanctions, because Venezuelan oil production was actually quite stable between 2008 and 2015 at 2.4, 2.5 million barrels per day. Venezuelan oil production starts declining in 2016 at a moment of low oil prices when production was declining in a lot of countries, particularly high-cost producers. So that decline wasn't really that surprising. But in all of those countries, when oil prices started recovering, oil production stabilizers started recovering. What we find in Venezuela is that in August of 2017, there's an inflection in the trend of oil production, where the rate of decline goes from 1% per month to 3% per month. Then we find another point of inflection in 2019, January of 2019, as oil sanctions are imposed on Venezuela and PDVSA, the state-owned oil company, is designated by OFAC. There we find a decline of 40% in oil production that occurs within 2 months. And then oil production stabilizes, and then we have another decline that occurs in February, which is when the U.S. targets Rosneft and other oil partners that were helping sell Venezuelan oil. At the time at which the U.S. sanctions that, most international companies had decided that they weren't going to market Venezuelan oil because of fear of U.S. sanctions. So Rosneft was actually carrying out 75% of the country's oil trade, international oil trade at the time, and they were responsible essentially for 100% of the country's gasoline imports. So you remember seeing stories about huge levels of gasoline scarcity in Venezuela in 2020. They occurred right after the Rosneft sanctions, because Rosneft were the only ones who were willing to bring gasoline into Venezuela. And that's why Venezuela, precisely in an example of the type of solidarity between sanctioned countries that you have been talking about, that's why Venezuela actually starts importing gasoline from Iran. By the way, there was actually a tanker of oil that had been purchased by Venezuela coming from Iran that was seized in the high waters, brought to the U.S., and actually sold in the U.S. And part of the proceeds did not even go, they definitely didn't go to the Venezuelan government, to the Maduro-headed Venezuelan government. They didn't even go to the government that pretended to be Venezuelan government, which is Guaido's government. They went to pay for Trump's border wall. So the fact is that you see, we've seen clearly in the data that the decline of oil production is significantly associated with the imposition of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela. Now, with time series data, there are always questions of interpretation. And some people have said, well, but there were other things that happened in August of 2017, and there were other things that happened in January of 2019. There were other things that happened in February of 2020. I mean, those arguments taken by one by one might make sense. It's like, imagine somebody has an episode of anaphylactic shock right after they eat lobster. Well, the first time that it happens, you may come up with an explanation of something else. You know, maybe they had like this really energetic discussion or a fight with a family member at the table, and that's what caused it. You know, the second time that it happens after they eat lobster, then it's pretty hard to come up with another explanation. The third time that it happens, then it's really pretty much impossible. However, nevertheless, and this is kind of what I have to deal with as an economist, I've had to contend with discussions with other Venezuelan economists who are very much aligned with another vision of the world. Some of them who are, I think, are good economists and have done some careful work, but whose work on this issue has tended to be, I would say, somewhat sloppy. And I think that the sign of that is when you see people who are very prominent economists but are unwilling to use the peer review process to publish on the issue of sanctions, then that's a pretty good signal. The reality is that every single peer-reviewed study on Venezuela sanctions finds a negative significant effect of those sanctions. In particular, precisely because of the need to establish this, not just beyond any reasonable doubt, but even beyond unreasonable doubts, we've gone to the length of looking, for example, at firm-level data in Venezuela, distinguishing between firms that had access to finance and those that did not have access to finance prior to the 2017 sanctions. Why is that important? Because the 2017 sanctions targeted access to finance. What do we find when we look at the different joint ventures in the Venezuelan oil sector? That those that had access to finance previous to the financial sanctions had been seeing production growing. Of course, they had access to finance, and the finance helped finance investment and help for that production to grow. After the imposition of the financial sanctions, we see that they stopped growing, they started declining at the same rate as those that had no access to finance. That's what's called a difference in differences analysis. It's in a paper published in the Latin American Economic Review last year. So the evidence here, the bottom line is that the evidence is very clear that sanctions have had a negative significant effect and have contributed significantly to Venezuela's economic implosion. We've had a decline of 78% in food imports. And actually, this is quite interesting. We had a decline of 91% in imports, but we had a decline of only 78% in food imports, which means that there was a prioritization of food imports during the period starting in 2016, precisely as a response to the sanctions. There were significant increases in the food coverage through the government's CLAP program, which, in fact, if you look at the amount of resources, it's about the subsidy implicit in the government's food bags program is of around $800 million a year, which is more than 50% of all of the economy's food imports. I would say that without that program, we would have most definitely seen a famine in Venezuela.
1 minute, please.
Just to round up, the fact is that there is very clear evidence that sanctions have negative, significant effects on the populations, on the living standards of populations in target countries. This has been well identified in the empirical literature. It's very clear in Venezuela, it's very clear in Iran, it's very clear in Afghanistan, it's very clear in just about every single case in which sanctions are imposed. The fact that this debate, which has been more than established in the scientific literature, that these results are routinely ignored by US policymakers is something that should really concern us. And it reflects a callous, and I would say even a criminal disregard for the suffering of people in developing countries. And it is my belief that no country that expresses such disregard and such contempt for the suffering of some of the world's most vulnerable groups can call itself a champion of freedom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. It's especially important that we're armed with empirical evidence, peer-reviewed empirical evidence to dismantle the myth that sanctions are targeted. They're not targeted. They have negative side effects on the general population. Our last panelist is Mark Weisbrot. And Mark Weisbrot is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington. He received his PhD in economics from the University of Michigan. He's author of the book, Failed, What the, quote, experts, unquote, got wrong about the global economy. Co-author also with Dean Baker of Social Security, The Phony Crisis. And Mark Weisbrot has written numerous research papers on economic policy. He writes a regular column on economic and policy issues that's distributed to over 550 newspapers by the Tribune Content Agency. His opinion pieces have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, the Guardian, and almost every major U.S. newspaper, as well as in Brazil's largest newspaper, Folha de Sao Paulo. He appears regularly on national and local television and radio programs. Let's welcome Mark Weisbrot.
Thanks for that intro, and thanks to everybody for organizing this. And I want to talk some. I mean, Francisco did a great job, and he knows the Venezuelan. I'm going to say this because he won't brag. He knows the Venezuelan economy better than anybody, I think, and also is one of the probably the leading expert in the world on sanctions. So I won't add too much. I will just add one thing to the collapse. You know, the 72% decline, which is the worst peacetime decline in history, pretty much, and I think one part of it could be the hyperinflation was so prolonged. You know, hyperinflation is a disaster. Basically, the classic definition is 13,000% annually, or 50% a month, and Venezuela. And you know, you've had like seven episodes since World War II in Latin America, and the median duration was 4 months. Venezuela had over 3 years, okay? And why is that? You can see, in addition to all the things he said that the sanctions do, I think one of the things they do is they prevent you from recovering. It's not always that hard to recover from hyperinflation, which really destroys your economy. People don't want to hold the domestic currency. And so you can do exchange rate-based stabilization in some cases. For example, in Bolivia, they got rid of hyperinflation in 10 days in 1985. And the other ones I said, you know, were not that long. This is 3 years of a really terrible destruction of your economy, and a lot of it is the hyperinflation. I say that because, you know, in the media, you hear about the inflation in Venezuela, and the government is blamed for it, and they did have high inflation before the sanctions, but they could have, you know, this is a country that had 300 billion in oil reserves. They could have gotten some foreign currency somewhere to stop the inflation depreciation spiral, for example. They could have gotten, you know, they could have done so many different things, and they couldn't do it because these sanctions blocked them at every level in as Francisco described. And that's, I think, part of it. And this gets to, and I want to talk more about, you know, what can be done about this, because this is an audience that is doing something, and I want to thank you all again for that, because this is something that they get away with. As Francisco said, it's really become a main weapon of the United States. I would say possibly more important than the military right now in terms of coercion in the world. And now this is largely because the U.S. controls the international financial system. That's a huge part of it. And so there are countries right now as we speak, because the progressive governments have come back in a number of countries now, and they're looking for ways to create some alternatives to their dependence on the U.S. based financial system. I think it was mentioned you know, that it's a dollar-based system, but that isn't going to change that fast. You know, 60% of central bank reserves are dollars or dollar-denominated assets, and that's about the same as it was 40 years ago. So that will move too, but there are other things, and I won't have time to go into those now. But one thing we can do here, because we're here in the United States where the source of the problem is the Congress. I want to read something from Jim McGovern, who some of you saw yesterday, because he was chair of the House Rules Committee. This is less than 2 years ago he said this, and so he's a powerful member of Congress. And he wrote a letter to Biden calling for an end to the sanctions against Venezuela. And he said, Beginning in 2017 under former President Trump, the U.S. began to impose ever wider sectoral and secondary sanctions on the oil economy, the Maduro government, and entities supporting the government. And the justification of these sanctions was to force a regime change. He said that. And he said, most importantly, that the impact of sectoral and secondary sanctions, the sanctions they impose, is indiscriminate and purposely so. Although U.S. officials regularly say that the sanctions target the government and not the people, the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign is to increase the economic cost of Venezuela of failing to comply with the conditions that the United States imposes. So he said it straight out. You're targeting the civilian population in order to undermine and overthrow the government. That's what the United States does with sanctions. And the reason they get away with this is because almost nobody knows that. Most of Congress doesn't even know it. And I'm not saying a lot of them would care, but some of them would, actually. And some of them do already. And so this is, I think, how we're going to win. That's why I want to emphasize it. This is what happened, if I want to go into a little hopey, changey thing, the positive side, okay? I mean, we did pass a war powers resolution in both houses of Congress just a couple of years ago. And that was the first time that the Congress used the 1973 legislation to tell the president to get out of the war in Yemen, okay? And it's not over yet, but it will be. And that was a first, and that was a product of a lot of work. It took 6 years, and that's way too long. And so I think that this is also winnable. But the way we're going to win it is we have to keep saying what sanctions are doing. They're killing people. McGovern was polite. He didn't use the word kill. He said harm. But when I first started looking into this, I wrote a paper with Jeff Sachs in 2019, and we looked at the mortality, because for the first, you had some mortality data from these 3 universities who were opposition, and they didn't release it. It came from the UN because they leaked it, and so, but then it became established, and it showed a 31% increase in mortality from 2017 to 2018. 1 year, okay? That was 40,000 dead if you calculate it. And so we did that paper. And we were just talking about this yesterday. We need more to show very clearly the link between the sanctions and mortality. But that was kind of obvious at the time. Like, Francisco said, okay, we had a lot of lobsters now, and they're all causing the same thing. But this is really serious. I'll put just to a little bit more economics. There's econometric research by the Bank for International Settlements on the link between recessions and mortality. So it shows how in developing countries, when there's a recession, a lot of people die. In fact, their regression controlling for everything they could showed a 0.5% increase in mortality for 0.5 per thousand people increase in mortality for recession, and twice that in the bottom quintile. So if you just look at that, even the small estimate, that would be 15,000 people in a country the size of Venezuela, and that wasn't a recession. That was the worst depression ever in Latin America. So these data make sense, okay? These data in the tens of thousands and probably hundreds of thousands worldwide of people dying because of the impact of sanctions on the economy are very believable to me. So, and then you also, I should say, you have people like Mike Pompeo who said that that's what they do with the sanctions, and I won't bother to read it, but he's bragging about it, okay? He's saying that, well, I will say it, well, he says to a reporter who's asking him, how's it going in Venezuela? He said, this was 2019. Well, we wish things could go faster, but I'm very confident that the tide is moving in the direction of Venezuelan people and will continue to do so. The circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis crisis is increasing by the hour. I talked with our senior person on the ground there in Venezuela. You can see the increasing pain and suffering of the Venezuelan people. That's, how he said the same thing for Iran. So these people didn't even care. They just said it straight out. But McGovern is the first U.S. official to actually say it from a point of view that this is something wrong. And again, that's why I think it's so important that we get that out there. Whenever we talk about sanctions, we have to talk about the mortality and the deaths that you have from these sanctions. Now, the other part, I think, that people can understand, the media will eventually report. And by the way, since Juan is here, we sent out a press release when McGovern made that statement because they didn't do it. And Democracy Now! Was the only one who picked it up. So I just want to give that shout out to Democracy Now! Because that was pretty important news, and the media ignored it. And they're still ignoring this impact of sanctions. So we have to go to the media as well. But the extent that we get more members of Congress and other government officials to say this, it'll get out there. Now the sanctions, the other part of it that I think can help this effort to get rid of them is the legal part of it. First, they violate U.S. law because they issue those executive orders saying that Venezuela and these other countries are a threat to, a usual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security. That's obviously a lie. And so that could be challenged in court also. But I think you have treaties, and one that resonates more with older people who can remember the Geneva Conventions being talked about, at least, not necessarily lived through it, but it's, the Geneva Convention prohibits exactly what they call the collective punishment that sanctions inflict, but there's a technicality that it doesn't, so it's not a war crime because there's no war. So the UN has put out several statements saying, if something's a crime, a war crime when people are shooting at each other, it ought to be a crime when they're not. And so that, I think, can be used also in terms of convincing people on this. And I want to also put the sanctions in the context, too, because this is about the Monroe Doctrine, which is, an example of, okay, I've got 2 minutes to say this, I will do it, okay?
Do it.
This is part of a system of domination that, that is really led by the U.S. with its European allies. They control the IMF, the World Bank, mostly the WTO, because they couldn't even get, the developing countries wanted vaccines, and they couldn't even get that passed. And so you see, the sanctions are a weapon that really, I've only mentioned the direct harm and death that they cause, but there's an indirect harm. It really prevents countries from developing. And I'll give just one example from Latin America. When you had what many people called the second independence of Latin America in the first decade of this century, poverty from 2000, no one disputes these numbers, poverty from 2002 to 2013 was reduced from 44 to 28% after it had been increasing for 2 decades under the US-sponsored neoliberal economic policies. So that's the other cost of this sanctions and the power that the destructive power that they have. They actually keep countries from getting and exercising the sovereignty they need to save lives and improve their living standards. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Weisbrot, because not only in this discussion that you've had today, but in previous research, you've helped expose the human impact of sanctions. Let's give a hand to the entire panel. It's been great. Well, a lot happens in between sessions, so I trust that you'll be able to engage in conversation with the panelists and others as the conference proceeds.
Thank you so much to the panelists. Great
Thank
job. Because of the time that we lost, we're not going to have a break now. You can get up and stretch, but don't leave, just because the other panel's coming up right now, and then we will have our lunch break. So if people want to do any kind of activism yoga, you can get up. Reach for your dreams. Reach for your dreams. Move to your left. Pull the people from the right. Move to your left. Stay in place.
And history teaches us that as the U.S. hegemony declines, the U.S. imperialist offensive grows. We know that. The expression of this are their effort to expand NATO, their strengthening of sanctions, their desire to continue to push retrograde policies internally in the U.S. and also abroad. The ruling class and its two-party system continues to lie to justify a military budget of, guess what, $900 million. They continue to lie to continue to justify 800 military bases all over the world. They continue to lie and tell not only the US population, but the rest of the world, that is in our best interest to have killing mechanisms like NATO, like AFRICOM, like the Southern Command, and we know that they're lying. The good news is that many, many, many nations in the global South have woken up to those lies. And they have created mechanisms and structures to counteract what the US imperial force has been, not only in our region, but globally. The Bolivarian Revolution and the Cuban Revolution, two socialist projects, because that is also a model that we need to uplift, two socialist projects have been at the head of the creation of organisms like CELAC, like ALBA TCP, that are models that oppose US imperialist force in this continent and provide a model internationally. And so today this panel will speak to these two opposing forces. Two opposing forces, again, that are very decisive, not only to nation states, but to people of good consciousness. Do we stand behind death and mechanisms of war and militarization, or do we stand behind mechanisms of life and projects that are there to make sure that there are democratic negotiations amongst nation states, that there is collaboration, and that there is a policy that is invested and has at the very core the needs and interests of the working class people of the world. That is what this panel is about. So I would like to invite you all to give a great round of applause to our panelists. And now I'm gonna read because I don't wanna mess up the introductions. So our first speaker is Francesca Emanuel. She is a Peruvian analyst and researcher and regular contributor to the online newspapers Huayca and Noticias Ser. She is currently pursuing a PhD in public anthropology at American University. Give it up. Focusing on international organizations, in particular, the Organization of American States. Francesca is also a senior research fellow at CEPR. Previously, she was the director of publications for the sexual and reproductive rights nonprofit Promex in Peru, and is a columnist for Peruvian dailies Diario 16 and Exitoso. Let's welcome Francesca.
Good afternoon to everyone. It is an honor to be here today with these great speakers and moderators. Thank you very much. Let me tell you about the most dominant regional diplomatic organization in the Western Hemisphere, the Organization of American States, the OAS. Today, almost all countries in the Americas have a permanent representative in this organization, except for Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. These three are the precise nations in the region subjected to unilateral sanctions by the United States. And the connection appears less coincidental when you learn that while the OAS comprises 34 member states, the US provides around 50% of the organization's annual budget. When factoring in additional donations, this contribution increases to 60%. For those unfamiliar with the OAS, its headquarters is here in Washington, D.C., right across from the White House. It is a beautiful building that has a statue of Queen Isabella I at the entrance, which was donated to the OAS in the 60s by the Spanish dictatorship of Francisco Franco. As you know, Queen Isabella was instrumental in funding Columbus' expedition to the Americas, leading to the invasion and colonization of the region, which resulted in the worst genocide in human history. Despite this, Isabella's image welcomes visitors to the OAS. Some might argue that at the very least, this symbolism demonstrates the OAS transparency regarding its core values. Well, if there is an international organization still in existence that was founded reflecting the spirit of the Monroe Doctrine, it is the OAS. The OAS is an initiative that originated in the United States, tracing back to the late 19th century when US Secretary of State James Blaine co-opted Simón Bolívar's honorable idea of a League of Hispanic American Republics for regional solidarity and collective security to safeguard the sovereignty of the newly independent countries. Blaine's goal, however, was to solidify US control in the hemisphere by establishing an organization to facilitate commercial advantage for the US. In 1890, Blaine convened 17 Latin American countries in Washington, D.C., right here, and celebrated the first International Pan-American Conference, which resulted in the creation of the Commercial Bureau of the American Republics, initially housed in the State Department before moving to the current OAS headquarters in 1910. Blaine understood that US investors could expedite the process of capital expansion under a legal framework established at the state level and controlled by the US. So in other words, for my Marxist friends here, the direct forerunner of the OAS played a crucial role in sparking the process that shaped a trend of capital accumulation in the North and economic poverty in the center and south of the hemisphere. But of course, this discussion is for another panel or another conference. So later, the Commercial Bureau changed its name to the Pan-American Union. The US kept leading Pan-American conferences and also invading countries in the Americas during that period, and with a more careful approach in the 30s under the good neighbor policy. At the onset of the Cold War, the US pushed for a mutual defense agreement to consolidate influence in the region and counter the spread of communism, particularly from the Soviet Union. This agreement, known as the Rio Treaty, stipulated that if any foreign power attacked the countries in the Americas that had signed it, they would unite and collectively resist the aggression, of course, militarily. The OAS, and this is important, was founded 1 year later in 1948, primarily as a decision-making forum for implementing this treaty, for implementing the Rio Treaty. Naturally, to maintain a permanent diplomatic forum, it was necessary to enhance it with additional mandates, such as fostering economic development, promoting democracy, peace, justice, and so on. As a critical aspect of the founding of the OAS was the US acceptance, at least in writing, of the principles of sovereignty and non-intervention in the internal affairs of other member countries. This acknowledgement was considered a significant victory for Latin American nations that had been urging the US to embrace these principles since the early 20th century. However, as long as the OAS pursues goals of US superiority, achieving these principles will be challenging. The OAS was not merely a US initiative, but has consistently adapted to the US needs to strengthen its dominance in the region. Initially, it functioned as a platform to facilitate favorable business contracts for the US and draw investors to its member countries. Later, it transformed into a regional front to confront communism, while under the banner of ideals of self-determination and sovereignty. But soon, it became evident that these principles were dispensable. The case of Cuba is a primary example. The OAS remained silent during the US-sponsored Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which was an attempt to overthrow the Cuban government. Shortly after, the OAS expelled Cuba from the organization after Fidel Castro declared the country's alliance to Marxist-Leninist principles. This revealed that the non-interventionist commitment in the OAS charter had ideological limitations. In essence, the OAS implied that hemispheric integration was contingent on supporting capitalism, especially capitalism favorable to the United States. The OAS helped in isolating Cuba. It voted to impose sanctions and further assisted the US by providing the legal basis through the Rio Treaty to impose a blockade on Cuba during the missile crisis. Meanwhile, the OAS was silent towards long-standing, openly oppressive regimes allied with the US, including the Somoza regime in Nicaragua, Stroessner in Paraguay, and Duvalier in Haiti. But not only are the OAS principles selectively implemented or respected, the organization itself also exhibits a broad and changeable nature, making it challenging to understand it and anticipate its moves. Its regulations are vague, and the Secretary General, who heads the organization, has almost unquestionable authority, even over member states. This gives the Secretary General significant power to dominate the most debated issues in the forum. Additionally, the OAS has been an incubator of all kinds of ideas and initiatives, primarily conforming to the key objectives of its main contributor, the US. For instance, the OAS served as the platform for introducing the Alliance for Progress in the 60s, an interventionist initiative designed to counteract the proliferation of communism in the region, and that ultimately contributed to the rise of dictatorships and the perpetuation of economic dependency in Latin America. Moreover, the concept of the Inter-American Development Bank was first conceived during an OAS meeting. And to fully grasp the intricacies of the OAS, it is important to understand its significant and somewhat disorganized growth over time. The OAS has established numerous bodies over the years, such as the Summit of the Americas, which in its inaugural meeting in the 90s or mid-90s, 1994, aimed to promote a free trade area of the Americas that would consolidate the Washington Consensus. This could have had disastrous consequences. On the other hand, the OAS also has bodies more favorable to public opinion, like the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Both entities are well regarded in our countries for their role in reporting human rights violations. This intricate network of interrelated bodies within the OAS, occasionally marked by contradictions, contributes to the organization's resilience, making it difficult to contest. Furthermore, this complexity has allowed the OAS to endure despite involvement in serious offenses against the sovereignty of multiple countries in the region. Taking this complexity into account, I would like to discuss the more recent OAS, our OAS right now, and please note that I will only address a fraction of its latest interventionist action, which are, of course, always aligned with US foreign policy. During the 1990s, the OAS continued its tradition of evolving along the US foreign policy paradigm. This shift led the OAS to prioritize the promotion of democracy. As a result, the organization established the Department of Electoral Cooperation and Observation, which has since carried out more than 200 electoral observation missions throughout the region. Today, the OAS has positioned itself as the leading authority on electoral integrity in the Americas. When countries in Latin America and the Caribbean hold elections, it is widely expected that they invite the OAS to observe in order to establish the legitimacy of the electoral process. This significant influence has provided the OAS with the capability to destabilize democracies without resorting to invasions, as the United States has done in the past within the region. In 2011, the OAS arbitrarily changed the results of the first round of Haiti's presidential elections. And in 2019, it played a direct role in unleashing a coup d'etat in Bolivia by falsely claiming that the presidential election results, which declared Evo Morales the winner, were fraudulent. In the aftermath, a far-right government took power in Bolivia and subsequently orchestrated 2 violent massacres targeting indigenous population. In both cases, Haiti and Bolivia, it was later discovered that the OAS misrepresented facts and undermined the democratic process. In my view, the role of the OAS in laying the foundation for the coup in Bolivia represents the most egregious crime by this organization in recent history. And it establishes a precedent that should not only place the entire region on alert, but also prompt a strong desire to reform within the organization. Now, I'm almost there. Now, as an anthropologist and considering the limited time at my disposal, I would like to zoom in and address the influential players within the OAS. Well, I'm convinced that the OAS suffers from a fundamental structural flaw tied to its inception. I also believe that we activist citizens, academics, can reduce damage if we identify where the power lies and push for accountability. And this power in the OAS is concentrated in the hands of the Secretary General, Luis Almagro. Throughout his 2 terms as Secretary General, Almagro has resurrected the Monroe Doctrine. Remember when Trump entertained the idea of invading Venezuela? Well, Almagro claims that he was the architect of US policy towards Venezuela. But Almagro has gone even further, turning the OAS into a hub for international right-wing Latin American politicians. His office serves as a central point for far-right figures in the region, and he uses the OAS apparatus to empower or rescue these individuals. Recently, he secured an OAS position for Ecuador's former president, Lenin Moreno, in Paraguay, allowing Moreno to evade anti-corruption investigations in his home country. Almagro also established a so-called pact of impunity with the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who is now imprisoned in New York on drug trafficking charges. Almagro supported Hernandez's grip on power by sabotaging an OAS-sponsored commission investigating corruption in Honduras. Ultimately, Almagro has taken control of the entire organization by abusing various regulations and infiltrating all levels, even extending his influence to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which compromises its autonomy. And of course, Almagro played a crucial role in the coup d'etat in Bolivia, and even now, despite the abundance of evidence debunking the OAS falsehoods, Almagro continues to uphold the lie. It is worth noting that a group of Democratic Congress members recently sent a letter to US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, calling for an investigation into Almagro's wrongdoings and other related issues. The crimes, or these crimes, are still fresh. And therefore, it is imperative to hold Almagro and the OAS accountable if we want to build an independent and sovereign future for the region. These actions by the OAS must be investigated and brought out of the obscurity which the organization promotes. We must demand reparations. The people of Bolivia who experience a fascist dictatorship and the people of Honduras who endure a violent narco state deserve that the OAS make amends for the harm it caused. Addressing these issues is key to paving the way for comprehensive reform of the OAS. This may involve rethinking the organization's structure, functions, and goals, relocating its headquarters, and adjusting the contributions of the member countries. Without these changes, the OAS will continue to prioritize US interests and empower a Latin American political class that is content with maintaining the region as the US backyard. In parallel, it is essential to strengthening alternative regional cooperation initiatives, such as the UNASUR, which already has an established headquarters and reinforces the formation of a South American region, or la CELAC, promotes a vision of unity and cooperation among Latin American and Caribbean countries. It is more likely that Latin Americans can break free from US interference if we work together and present a united front against attempts to subjugate the region. It is time to reclaim Bolivar's dream of a united and independent region that works together for the benefit of all its people. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francesca. We're going to hear from Dr. Jemima Pierre. She is professor at UCLA, jointly appointed in the Department of African American Studies and the Department of Anthropology. She is also a research associate at the inaugural Center for the Study of Race, Gender, and Class at the University of Johannesburg. Her research and teaching interests are located in the overlaps between African studies and African diaspora studies and engage three broad areas: race and political economy, transnationalism and diaspora, and the cultural politics of knowledge production. A first-generation immigrant from Haiti, Dr. Pierre has also published extensively on the impacts of ongoing US imperialism in Haiti. She serves as a co-coordinator for the Haiti Americas team of Black Alliance for Peace. Let's welcome Dr. Jemima Pierre.
Thank you all.
You should,
Is it? Oh.
yeah, it's on. You just move it forward.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm excited to be part of this conversation and to be with you, and to be speaking on behalf of the Black Alliance for Peace. In December 2019, President Donald Trump signed into law H.R. 2116, the Global Fragility Act. While this act was developed by the neoconservative and ironically titled United States Institute for Peace, it was introduced to Congress by Democratic Representative Eliot Engel, then chair of the House Committees on Foreign Affairs, and co-sponsored by a bipartisan group of representatives. The Global Fragility Act represents a new set of strategies for deploying US soft power in a changing world. It focuses US foreign policy on the idea there are so-called fragile states, which are a threat to the US because of their, quote, instability, extremism, conflict, and extreme poverty, end quote. Things which would lead, according to this act, to significant migration, which the US wants to prevent. Therefore, the stated aim of the Global Fragility Act is to tackle the quote-unquote root causes of instability in fragile states. Hailed as landmark legislation and as a potential game changer in the world of US foreign policy, the act seems to be a resetting of that policy in ways that shift tactics while maintaining the objectives and strategies of US global domination. The act clearly articulates its main goal, to advance US national security and interests, and to manage rival powers, and that is specifically Russia and China. In this sense, the Global Fragility Act, especially for governments and societies in the Western Hemisphere, seems to be a revamping of the Monroe Doctrine. One of the stated objectives of the Global Fragility Act is for the US government to be proactive in preventing conflict and instability. Preventing conflict, promoting stability in countries prone to violence, the support of locally driven political institutions. This is the language that the act uses to hide the legislation's real intentions, to rebrand US imperialism by using a wide range of actors and resources, including neocolonial governments and their local and regional structures, to enact policies aimed at upholding US global power. What is significant about this act is the way that it uses other nations to carry out its objectives, a point that I will come to later. In April 2022, the Biden-Harris administration affirmed its commitment to implementing the Global Fragility Act by issuing documents outlining a 10-point plan that will allow the integration and sequencing of US diplomatic, development, and military-related efforts. Funding was allocated in the 2023 budget. The management of the Global Fragility Act formally brings together the US Agency for International Development, its parent, the State Department, and the Department of Defense. There are 5 trial countries for the implementation of this act, and Haiti is the first. My comments today focus on one key point, that Haiti has been and continues to be the main laboratory for US imperial machinations, both in the region and throughout the world. It is no surprise, therefore, that in the rearticulation of a new policy for maintaining global hegemony, the Global Fragilities Act, Haiti is the first target. Without understanding this point, without seeing Haiti as the site of the longest and most brutal neocolonial experiment in the modern world, we cannot fully understand the workings of US and Western hegemony. And if we cannot understand the full extent of US hegemony, we cannot defeat it. Consistent in its hypocrisy, in its deliberation on the Global Fragilities Act, US officials label Haiti as one of the most fragile states, even as the supposed fragility is caused by more than a century of US interference and consistent push to deny Haitian sovereignty. It is therefore important to understand the long history and nature of US imperialism through militarism in Haiti, a clear model of both the role of militarism and the intricate and diffuse enactments of this militarism as imperialism. To begin with, we must recognize that Haitian sovereignty has been snuffed out, and that Haiti is under current foreign military and political control. Of course, we know the first military occupation occurred from 1915 to 1934. But Haiti lost its sovereignty this time, beginning February 2004. Its state has been dismantled and its government taken over by occupying foreign forces. The plans for this intervention and occupation were hatched in Ottawa, Canada in 2003. Dubbed the Ottawa Initiative in Haiti, the objective was to decide the future of Haiti's governance. The administration of Canadian Prime Minister Jean Chrétien and his Liberal Party government organized a 2-day conference at Meech Lake, attended by top officials from the US, the European Union, and the OAS. There were no representatives from Haiti. Canadian journalist Michael Vastal, who got wind of this secret meeting, reported that the discussion in Ottawa included, quote, the possibility of Aristide's departure, the need for a potential trusteeship over Haiti, end quote. By the end of February 2004, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, the popularly elected president of Haiti, was deposed, bundled onto a flight by US Marines, and flown to the Central African Republic. US President George W. Bush announced almost immediately that he was sending US forces to, quote, help stabilize the country, end quote. On the same night of Aristide's extradition, 200 US troops had already landed at the airport in Haiti. By the evening of the day of the coup, 2,000 US, French, and Canadian soldiers were already on the ground. In the meantime, at the behest of the members of the United Nations Security Council, US and France, the UN Security Council passed a unanimous resolution that authorized, quote, the immediate deployment of a multinational interim force for a period of 3 months to help secure and stabilize the capital, Port-au-Prince, and elsewhere in the country, end quote. UN Resolution 1529 was passed under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, which authorized the deployment of UN military force to, quote, take all necessary measures to fulfill its mandate. Now, unlike a Chapter 6 resolution, which refers to peacekeeping missions where parties of conflict give their consent, a Chapter 7 resolution demands no such consent. Haiti is the only place in the world that was not embroiled in civil war, but that received a Chapter 7 deployment, where UN forces are allowed to use military force to, quote, pacify the population. Thus, it is important to note that the 2004 illegal coup d'etat was both enforced and cleaned up with the sanction of the UN. On June 1st, 2004, the UN officially took over from US forces and established the United Nations Stabilizing Mission in Haiti, or MINUSTA, the acronym for its French name, for the task of military occupation under the guise of establishing peace and security. A multi-billion-dollar operation, MINUSTA had, at any given time, between 6,000 and 12,000 troops and police stationed in Haiti, alongside thousands of bureaucrats, technical staff, and civilian personnel. And we all know, in a horrific parallel to the first occupation, Minister soldiers committed numerous acts of violence against the Haitian people, including massacres and rapes. Minister soldiers are responsible for bringing cholera into the country, a disease that officially killed 30,000 people and infected almost 1 million. But what's most solidified this occupation was the creation and operationalization of the core group. The core group, an international coalition of self-proclaimed and non-Black friends of Haiti, friends in quote, was established as part of the UN resolution that brought these foreign soldiers and technocrats into Haiti. Its stated goal was to oversee Haiti's governance through the coordination of various branches of the UN mission. While it is claimed that this occupation officially ended in 2017 with the formal drawdown of the minister mission, the UN has remained in Haiti through a new office with a new acronym, BINU, the United Nations Integrated Office in Haiti. BINU's mandate has been continuously renewed from 2017 to now by the UNSC, the United Nations Security Council. BINU has had an outsized public role in Haitian internal political affairs and is the mouthpiece of the core group. While the core group's membership has fluctuated since its initial formation, it currently has 9 members: Brazil, Canada, France, Germany, Spain, the US, the European Union, the Organization of American States, and the UN. Significantly, this group has never had a Haitian representative and often meets without Haitian representation. Neither neutral nor passive, the core group plays an active interventionist role in Haiti's everyday political affairs. The overwhelming power of the core group is blatant public, visible to all who want to see it. At a special session on Haiti at the UN Security Council just this week, it was the head of the BINU, the UN mission in Haiti, who took the lead in presenting Haiti as a basket case of unthinking and violent gangs. Thus unelected and unaccountable by the Haitian people, the core group is the arbiter of neocolonial indirect rule in Haiti. US imperialism in Haiti is a hierarchical structure established through the power of the US as a superpower, which then outsources the colonial control of Haiti to others. Thus, for example, one of the reasons that this occupation of Haiti, which began in 2004, is not seen as such is that while it was initiated and largely funded by the US and the United Nations, Haiti's sovereignty has been extinguished by a multiracial, multinational coalition of Caribbean, Latin American, and African countries. This may be the most sinister and least talked about aspect of this occupation, but it's also the most effective. In a classified diplomatic cable from 2008, and thank you for WikiLeaks and Free Julian Assange, the US Ambassador Janet Sanderson explained the significance of MINISTA in the shifting US strategy for military intervention and occupation. Sanderson wrote, quote, "MINISTA is a remarkable product and symbol of hemispheric cooperation in a country with little going for it. There is no feasible substitute for this UN presence. It is a financial and regional security bargain for the US government. We must work to preserve MINISTA by continuing to partner with it at all levels in coordination with other major donors and MINISTA contributor countries from the hemisphere. That partnering would also counter perceptions in Latin America, in Latin contributing countries, that Haitians see their presence in Haiti as unwarranted," end quote. Brazil, for example, was in charge of the military wing of the occupations in 2004. It spent more than $750 million on maintaining military control. For Brazil, the country in Latin America with the largest Black population and leftist government at the time, Haiti was its imperial ground zero. But there was also buy-in from other marginalized governments from the Caribbean and Latin America. At one point, MINISTA's leadership included a representative from Trinidad and Tobago and an African-American attorney and diplomat. And this leadership was accompanied by a multinational military force made up of a number of South American, Caribbean, and African countries, including Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Jamaica, Grenada, Benin, Burkina Faso, Egypt, Cote d'Ivoire, Nigeria, Rwanda, Senegal, Guinea, Cameroon, Niger, and Mali. How do you hide an occupation? You diversify it. US imperialism involves a gamut of activities from diplomatic influence to cultural warfare to military intervention. It depends on a wide range of institutions, of actors, and diverse set of strategies, including the US State Department, the CIA, the USAID, which effectively determines how the occupied states' funds are distributed. It includes, funds, it distributes funds, it includes Western NGO projects, controlled opposition of youth groups, the use of the National Endowment for Democracy, and then US media and Western media, which often serves as mouthpieces for the ruling class, preparing the cultural ground for the outside world to accept whatever actions are planned for those under occupation. And here we have to acknowledge the deep racism in the representation and treatment of Haiti. It also includes local and Western-based churches and missionaries, and most importantly, neighboring neo-colonial governments. For Haiti, these governments are the Dominican Republic, and more recently, surprisingly, Mexico, who worked with the United States as a co-pen holder for Haiti at the UN Security Council last summer to advocate for foreign military intervention in the country. It is significant that the Global Fragilities Act lays out a plan to see if the US actions in Haiti over the past 20 years lays out a plan that, if we see the US actions in Haiti over the past 20 years, has already been implemented in Haiti. If we look around, the US has already used this practice in Haiti to extend a different kind of rule over the region. Militarization of the region, for example, has shifted. The US Southern Command, Southcom, is key example, incorporating the Caribbean and South and Central America. Southcom claims to be protecting human rights as long-term responsibility to the development of regional militaries controlled and facilitated by the US. I want to wrap up by pointing to the need to recognize Haiti's significant critical place as both a laboratory of US militarism and imperialism, but also as a site of not only laboratory of US militarism and imperialism, but also as a site of one of the longest struggles for both Black liberation and the anti-colonial independence in the Americas. It is for this reason we also understand why the US empire's interest in the expansion of its hegemony has resulted in the constant reactionary onslaught against the people of Haiti and decades of instability for the nation as a whole. The 2 centuries-long imperial counterinsurgency against Haiti has aimed to terminate the most ambitious revolutionary experiment in the modern world. It is no coincidence that the attacks on Haitian sovereignty through an arsenal of tactics has been consistent and consistently banal. We ignore these tactics. We ignore how these tactics will be used on the rest of the region to our peril. The Black Alliance for Peace team is coordinating with Collective Campaign to fight for a zone of peace. And this peace in the region must begin with Haiti.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Jemima. I just want to raise, if folks want to applaud when they actually are in, believe that what folks are saying up here is truth, you could feel free to do that. Because I saw so many shy moments. Like, do that. Energy, we need to also raise the energy in our movement, so do that. All right, so I want to introduce Dr. Jorge Zuniga. He earned his doctorate in philosophy at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University, Frankfurt, Germany. He has published a series of articles and book chapters on the theory of action, ethics, critical theory, social philosophy, biopolitics, and governmentality in Foucault. He has delivered lectures at conferences in Mexico, the US, Germany, Greece, Costa Rica, Chile, South Korea, Argentina, and Peru. He is professor of practical philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Letters at Autonomous University of Mexico. Welcome, Dr. Zuniga.
Thank you for the introduction and the presentation. I'm glad to be here with these great colleagues and with the moderator, as well as with this diverse audience who is with us. So my colleagues, they talk about this panel and the last panel. They gave us a lot of data, a lot of statistics, a lot of description of facts that are happening in Latin America. So I think they, as I saw you, as I could figure out, they did a good job. So in my case, I don't want to stress this data from economics or from political sciences. I would like to talk about more about how to construct alternatives, or in other words, how we can construct alternatives, because I think that that is one of the main points of this symposium. Because Monroe Doctrine belongs to the territorial coloniality, but in Latin America we have two challenges. The territorial coloniality, as well as was what we with Pablo Gonzalez Casanova can identify as domestic coloniality. That is one of the most important challenges we have to assume in Latin America, because we lived the first independence, the first emancipation in the 19th century, but we have our countries, our people lived coloniality in intern coloniality, no? Because of the elites, criollas, because of the elites, the elite that took the power of our countries, of our people, and they didn't make justice our original people, our Afro-descendant communities, people from Latin America and from the Caribbean. So I think that if we want to undermine this kind of ideological weapons of death, like the Monroe Doctrine, at the same time, we have to undermine this domestic colonialism that we live in Latin America and in the Caribbean since we became independent by the first time, when we became national states. No? The modern national states in Latin America, they perceive decoloniality in their own countries. So it is not enough to criticize the territorial coloniality as well as it was well placed by my colleagues with the OEA, for example, with the Monroe Doctrine. No, that's not enough. We have to fight in our countries in order to make justice to this, to the excluded from the first independence in Latin America. So why do we have to think about it, to think of this kind of situation? Because if we are in a kind of in a new call of history, due to the conditions, the U.S. government has to concede many policies they pushed in an imperialistic way. So this is the reason why, for example, in South America, from the global south, we are constructing, or we push the alternatives to this neo-colonial, neoliberal order that we live since the last century, the last 30 years in the last century. So I thought, why in the global south we construct, we push the alternatives to this colonial or neo-colonial order, because we have to live, because we want to live, because we can live with this order, political order of death. No? For that reason, I stated that Monroe Doctrine is an ideological weapon of death, because there are not only political, economical weapons, like the sanctions, for example, economical sanctions, like, for example, subordination, or these strategies that my colleague described well. No? The domination is ideological as well. And this idea that, and this tergiverse idea of America for Americans, that is something that is exhausted, and it is valid anymore. So this reminds me the statement on the other side that a few weeks ago, the President of Mexico, López Obrador, stated clearly to the U.S. government, nosotros ya no somos una colonia. We are not a colony anymore. So in this, that is what we need in Latin America. Any neoliberal governments that are supported by the U.S. governments. We need new political leaders who assume an ethical responsibility in relation to, regarded to our people, to our communities, and that can make justice as the well-known efforts by Lula da Silva or López Obrador have been made. So yeah, one point more, and this is not only we agree that this fight is political. We have to fight. We have to construct the alternative. No? In these two ways I underline in relation to the territorial coloniality and the domestic coloniality. But at the same time, and this is maybe a call for my colleagues in philosophy or sociologists and professors, researchers, we have to think about the theories that accompany. You have to think in theories that plays as company in this process of liberation towards a second emancipation in Latin America. Because here, and maybe it's because I have in mind some criticism from compañeros y compañeras that are really critical to ideas. But the problem is that ideas and new concepts help us to understand the social world and the social, the political world, the social world, the social sphere from other lens. And we need that. We have new concepts, new ideas in order to understand our current world. And that is maybe, I see many journalists here in this room, but for example, this is the reason why, and at least I see that situation clearly in Mexico. That is the reason why progressive journalists don't understand, for example, progressive governments, no, from Latin America, because they are building something new. These governments, like Lula da Silva, like Andrés Manuel, López Obrador, and they are really complex figures, no? And this is the reason why progressive journalists, for example, I think in CNN, no, that they are in Mexico, they are progressive and they work for CNN, but they don't understand this kind of changes in Latin America. They don't understand this kind of political figures like López Obrador, like Lula. No, that is the reason why, for example, it's easy to describe these figures as caudillos, for example, as dictators, and this is other thing. No, so no, I put only the example. I display this example with journalists, but what I want to mean is that all the social sciences, all the humanities, and now I relate directly to the theories. We have to be in the level of the current social world, and we have to develop these new theories that are a company of these political processes, no? And we have here in this room as well important and relevant authors that have developed this kind of theories, like the decolonial theory. That is one theory that we need in order to achieve this second emancipation. There are other theories like philosophy of liberation, for example, critical Latin American critical theory, and many the dependence theory, the economical dependence theory, and we need these theories just a ground in order to construct new ideas, new concepts, and new conceptions of the complex social world that we live in Latin America. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zuniga, precisely for reminding us of the battle of ideas, which is very important. The battle of ideas and the battle for emotions. All right, so our last speaker is going to be Professor Maldonado Torres. He's a professor at the Department of Latino and Caribbean Studies and the Comparative Literature Program. He obtained a PhD in 2002 at Brown University, Religious Studies with a certificate for outstanding work in Africana Studies, distinction Phi Beta Kappa. He is also co-editor of Latinos in the World System, Decolonization Struggles in the 21st Century, U.S. Empire, and guest editor of 2 special issues entitled Thinking Through the Decolonial Turn, Post-Continental Interventions in Theory, Philosophy, and Critique. Welcome, Professor Maldonado.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure being here with you today. I am now teaching in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Connecticut, but I'm coming here mainly as the co-director of the Franz Fanon Foundation. And it's a special pleasure coming from the foundation and seeing this event that is being organized and then sponsored by a great number of grassroots organizations. And I think that already that speaks to the kind of solutions that we want to advance. It's also a pleasure to be at an event that on the one hand we're meeting today to share some ideas, different forms of analysis, but that it started with a policy day yesterday where an organizer had the pleasure of joining the morning section of the discussions and preparations and some of the initial visits to legislators. So I think that again presenting a kind of a combative paradigm for knowledge sharing and knowledge production that we definitely need more of. So my congratulations to the organizers for gathering us, for bringing us together, and for offering us this model of building together. Now, when I initially learned about the event, and I'm going to be somewhat brief, I'm going to outline a series of points that are the ones that I would like to leave on the table for you. Right? And one of them is when I first was invited to the event to think about borrowing the Monroe Doctrine, to see about a new policy, a potential developing a new policy or advocating for a new policy in the US, for a new Latin America and the Caribbean, one of my first thoughts was, how are we going to advance in advocating for a new policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean when we live in a country that is keeping still very old policies, colonial, racist policies towards its own indigenous people. And when still in the 21st century, we have to march and go to the street to shout, Black Lives Matter. And when also still in the 21st century, the US remains a colonial power that controls the oldest colony in the modern world, the unincorporated territory of Puerto Rico. So where to begin? What are the bases that we think that we can generate that change when already, look who we're talking about, see about the public policy in place. So how to advocate for a change of foreign policy was my question when these are the conditions, right? And then how to do so then, maybe to engage in advocating for foreign policy while also simultaneously advocating for dramatic public policy change, both simultaneously and in an interrelational form. How to do that? That's what's one set of ideas and questions that emerged. The other was that when I look at Latin America, as it has been commented, here, that Latin America is still largely anti-indigenous, anti-black region, and with the exception of Cuba and Venezuela, most of the territory probably, I mean, I'll go there and put it like that, and we can then modify it. But most of the territory is somewhat or greatly indifferent to the condition of Puerto Rico because it's being incorporated in the U.S. So Puerto Rico is neither the U.S. or Latin America. It's in this limbo zone. And again, with the exception of Cuba and Venezuela, which tend to always come out in bringing out the topic about the colonization of Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico barely matters in the rest of the territory. So I was wondering whether, in addition to burying the Monroe Doctrine, we have to think about burying an old-fashioned 19th century idea of Latin America. Right? And therefore, if we have to build with indigenous movements and other movements that had advocated for different imaginaries and different conceptualizations of the region, like Abya Yala, Gran Comarca, and so on, that these are not simply slogans or kind of aesthetic or kind of literary provocations, but I think there are actually very important socio-political, cosmological, geographical, geopolitical implications of what that is. So what would it be to enter this debate, not thinking about a new Latin America, but about thinking of somehow going beyond Latin America itself, right? With that notion of the Latin America. And I think we can take our lead from places like the Caribbean, and Haiti will be in a leading role, taking us beyond these ideas, I think, too. Now, coming from, I am Puerto Rican, and this is the panel on militarism. So I could not obviate the fact that, particularly in this panel, that right now, 2023, this year, is the 20th anniversary of the expulsion of the Marines from the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico, in the archipelago of Puerto Rico, right? It was May 1st, so almost literally 20 years, right? And so I think that, Vieques is part of that story of the Monroe Doctrine. And the expulsion of the Marines 20 years ago is part of the story about how to bury it, right? And so the Marines occupied about 2/3 of the islands of Vieques, and they remained there for about 70 years. And there has been opposition to that presence for decades, but in 1999, there was the death of David Sanos Rodriguez during a military exercise, and that led to massive forms of coalition and protest that ultimately led to that expulsion. And from Vieques, or with regards to Vieques, I would like to highlight two things. And one was the power of those mobilizations and the strong forms of solidarity. Until then, until that moment, right, the mobilization in support of Vieques and against the presence of the Marines in the island of Vieques, they led to the most massive mobilizations known in Puerto Rico until that moment, and brought people from the different political parties, no matter the status they prefer for the island, the political status. Many of them were supporting that the Marines had to go. What used to be a slogan only for independentistas or those who advocated for independence then became a slogan for the entire nation. And so I think that there is something there very important, really very important about those junctures and conjunctures where those forms of solidarities take place and how do they take place. And so they remain there as forms of effective burying of something when we come together in that powerful way. More recently, we saw then another massive form of manifestation, even more massive, which was in 2019 in the Verano Combativo, the combative summer of 2019, that led to the outskirts, to the expulsion of the resignation of the governor, right, of the island. So again, I think that the island colony, the archipelago colony, is providing some fundamental examples and ideas and proposals about how to bury effectively some of these policies and ideas. Now, with Vieques, the other point that I want to highlight is the strong environmental, social, and economic impact of the military presence there. So Vieques is clearly an example that simple departures, retiradas, from colonial armed military power from territories that they had possessed for a long time are not enough to address the impact of their domination, right? So the impact of the Marines in Vieques cannot be solved without major reparations for Vieques. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has stood for some, a number of responses from the U.S. government to address the situation in the island. There is now also a sort of a bill that is being circulated by a very right-wing Puerto Rican politician who also is expected to run for governor soon. But the great irony of that proposal is that wrapped around the notion of rehabilitation, that these rehabilitations run short of the actual reparations needed in the island. And second, that how to address then reparations in Vieques without thinking about reparations for the entire archipelago of Puerto Rico for more than 100 years of colonialism. And so it's a tragedy and a catastrophe that among the options of political status in Puerto Rico, you don't find any of them that tells the people of Puerto Rico, well, you can decide for this status, but this status will require, and potentially all of them, massive forms of reparations to undo the damage that the U.S. presence has done in the island. And I think that the reparations will not have to be limited to the archipelago of Puerto Rico. They will have to extend to nearby islands and nearby territories as well. And something else to point out is that it doesn't suffice either with reparations for Vieques or even reparation for Puerto Rico, or how ironic would it be now for anyone to talk about rehabilitating Vieques, particularly when they're advocating for the presence and continued presence of the fiscal board in Puerto Rico, Promesa, that was created under Barack Obama, not Donald Trump. And that became a quite direct form of economic colonialism today. Now, the second point that I wanted to highlight is that this is also the year 2023 represents 125 years after 1898, when Puerto Rico then comes to be a territory of the United States. And so With 1888 then, there was, of course, a heavy military presence in Puerto Rico through the different military bases, not only in Vieques, but also in other parts of the island. And also, since then Puerto Ricans have been participated forcibly in many cases when there was the draft in the wars led by the US, Puerto Ricans in the Korean War, Puerto Ricans in the First and Second World Wars, Puerto Ricans in the war in Vietnam, and so on. So when we think about militarism and colonialism today, we need to look at these examples. And Puerto Rico, as some here in this group have well documented and pointed out, that Puerto Rico becomes a kind of zone for military recruitment today, right? So the island colony that, among other things, becomes a source for military power, even as it suffers from the presence of the military in the island. Now, I wanted then to think about, what are the sources in a place like Puerto Rico and going beyond Puerto Rico about how to overcome this militarism. I mean, how to explain the fact that many people in the island, colonized people, joined the military of the power that is dominating that very land, right? And you know that you have to prepare the ground for that. That doesn't happen automatically. You have to have a system of education that leads people to see this as completely normal, that they don't see the current status of the presence of the military as a problem. So you need a kind of heavy education system that is leading everyone to see themselves as the benefactors, as the recipients of the graces of US power, right? So the question is how then to intervene with another education, I think, is part of this, of our way of thinking about undermining militarism, undermining the desires that anyone can see in wanting to join the military, for example. What would that be to have an education that will lead to that kind of thinking? And I want to point out that the University of Puerto Rico actually has been traditionally a site of counter-colonial, anti-colonial, and counter-military stuff. And that it is not by chance then that the University of Puerto Rico has been kind of the target of these forms, heavy forms of impoverishment, of de-investing from the local commonwealth, quote-unquote commonwealth. So I think that whatever response we give to the problem of militarism in Puerto Rico, but also in other places, is connected with education, and is connected with a kind of education and alternatives to a military way of being and a military outlook in the world that are provided in schools and universities. Puerto Rico has actually, the University of Puerto Rico has been characterized for being particularly, again, counter-colonial and counter-military, but not necessarily countering anti-blackness. And that has been until very recently, when we have right now, at the moment when the university is so impoverished, we have some of the strongest forms of efforts. With recently una segunda cumbre Afro, there was a second summit dedicated to African people and African descendant peoples in Puerto Rico. And right now there's been a resurgence. So I think that is connected to the possibility of then reimagining the University of Puerto Rico as a site of both counter-colonial, counter-military, but also counter-anti-blackness generally. And finally, I end with this: as much as the university can offer, it will not be able, I think, to offer this kind of education soon. The best examples of this kind of counter-colonial, counter-military, and counter-anti-black racist forms of thinking appears on the ground in the education of groups like La Colectiva Feminista en Construcción, which offers workshops and that educates the entire people of Puerto Rico and beyond into what is a radical feminist, radical feminist thought grounded on decolonial thought and black feminism. And by doing that, they are putting themselves in Puerto Rico, drawing from black feminism, US black feminism, and drawing from anti-colonial theories from Latin America and the Caribbean, and they, I think, are at the leading edge of this kind of education that hopefully we can see at the University of Puerto Rico and that hopefully we can see in the schools, and then that can animate this larger resistance against colonialism and militarism in the island. Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Let's give them another round of applause. I think one important element to take from this panel is that part of burying 200 years of the Monroe Doctrine is also uncovering our truths as Latin American and Caribbean countries, as oppressed people generally, our histories of resistance, our mechanisms of survival, detached from capitalism and imperialism, understanding that capitalism and imperialism are antithetical to anything that has to do with solidarity, collaboration, democracy, and therefore we need to reimagine new ways of living, new ways of relating, and there are models that have been set out for us, models that have been suppressed, that have been attacked, that have been in a lot of ways attempted to be buried themselves, and they have resisted. They are still here. When Chavez passed, people thought that the Bolivarian Revolution was gonna die. The Bolivarian Revolution is still here. When we had the passing of Fidel Castro, it was the same thing. These imperialists believe, they really do believe, that they can counteract the people's will. And they do not count with the fact that when the people, the force of the people, is behind a revolutionary process, they cannot defeat it. And so let's be fed by that energy. Thank you so much for everything you've shared. Que viva Puerto Rico libre y socialista. Que viva Haití libre. Que vivan todos los pueblos del mundo de Latinoamérica.
Dicen las compañeras, que viva Perú también.
Que viva Perú también, soberano.
Lunch is ready. Let's try to be back here. Special guests first. Let's try to be back here by 2:20, please. We're going to get started with our next panel, hopefully on time. Special guest first. Lunch is ready. Thank you very much.
Ya